Okay, good evening, everybody. So it is the 7th of January, 2024. It's nearly 8 o'clock. And I'm here with Jerry. Now, a lot of people have seen the stuff I've shared of Jerry's, and this is probably going to be one of the most nuts things that people see. My audience follows me for my very interesting takes on things, my very nuanced ideas. I've kind of all my life been diving down rabbit holes and trying to figure out objectively what the truth is. That's come at the expense of a lot of, social ostracization and of the sort. I can say hand down the most the most interesting and kind of waking up moment was when I came across Jerry's stuff, because when you look at what's going on in the world, and actually just before me and Jerry were speaking, I was watching videos about the Federal Reserve, the plan for the digital currency, and you look at what's going on in the world, especially today, and I've always kind of thought, is it people that benefit from what's going on? And I think a lot of religious people pay lip service to the idea of the unseen realm and what in the Quran described as jinn. I think people think they're real to a degree, but mostly just pay lip service to it. And the reason I wanted to bring Jerry on today is this is as close as you can get to concrete evidence that there is a layer of reality that we can't see, and perhaps we aren't actually the top of the food chain. And when you look at all the atrocities that are going on in the world, it doesn't seem like any people would be benefiting from it. And that's because, well, what you're probably going to come to the conclusion today, if you have a cognitive brain that works and isn't encompassed by jinn yourself, is that it isn't people benefiting from it. It's an unseen realm. So this is going to fry people's brains. I very rarely personally, my attitude is very apathetic. I remember when I came across Jerry's stuff, it's funny because when I first watched your videos, and I'm not going to bang on for too long, I'm going to let you take the mantle on this one. But when I first came across your videos, I was listening to, I think it was it wasn't with Christopher Gardner, it was with someone else. And as I was listening with my earphones in at night, which wasn't the smartest thing to do. and yeah, that was the first time since I was about 10 that I'd felt worried. So this will probably be quite a long episode. I'm going to document this and probably come back to it myself just for future reading and bringing it back into my consciousness so I don't forget. So, Jerry, for people who don't know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you worked in psychiatry, predominantly with schizophrenic patients who hear voices.
More psychology than psychiatry.
Psychology. So
I'm not a psychiatrist and have no desire to be one.
I could imagine. So for almost, was it 40 years?
Well, it's closer to 45, and I'm still working with people. You know, I still have a private practice.
One thing we're going to touch on today is that the Mace energy method. I actually just had my first session.
Oh, good.
And it was crazy. We'll touch on that as we go through, but you know, when you put the pieces together as to what is permitted in psychiatry, I know you've got plenty of stories and I'll let you say them. When you look at what is promoted in helping people who have voices or mental health issues and what is condemned, when I did the Mace thing, it was kind of, and I'm not trying to like blow smoke up anybody's back end, but you know, you start to pull up memories that you totally forgot. And the speed at which it works in discharging negative identity, we'll get into it, but I'll let you give yourself a brief introduction for people who don't know, because obviously the backstory requires the context required. So I'll let you start off. Give yourself a brief introduction, Jerry.
Well, okay, I'm a retired licensed psychotherapist. I got probably over 45 years of experience working with and studying the processes of psychotic psychotics and the criminally insane, probably in some of the most volatile psychiatric institutions in the United States. I'm a commercial pilot. I'm a certified scuba diver, long distance motorcyclist. I held the position of second lieutenant in the Arizona Civil Air Patrol. I won the state of Arizona's Meritorious Service Award for programs I developed. I taught Pima College and won the Apple Award for teaching abnormal psychology. My formal academic training consists of a BA in psychology from Temple University, master's degree in rehab counseling from the University of Georgia, and 2 years in a PhD program, psychology. I'm the co-author of An Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind, Breaking the Spell of the Ivory Tower. And I'm currently in private practice in Arizona. So I've worked in virtually every kind of mental health situation or facility that the United States has to offer. I spent my last 10 years doing psychiatric crisis in hospital emergency rooms all over Tucson, Arizona, and the biggest hospitals in the city. So I've had a smattering of virtually everything that the mental health system in the United States has to offer. And unfortunately, the rest of the world has pretty much mimicked or copied the mental health system here that was taken over by the Rockefellers in 1910. And they bought off the United States Congress to make a law that the only medical doctors that could be graduated from U.S. universities had to go through a pharmacological curriculum, which means they taught that the only cure for virtually anything is drugs. Okay? So at that time, they knocked out naturopathy, they knocked out Tesla's violet ray, they knocked out acupuncture. Virtually every other form of treatment, including mace, would have been included in that system. Reiki, any other kind of health treatment, they knocked it out. So basically, they took over the United States medical system and just went from there. And now they're making, I think it's over $4 billion a year selling antipsychotic drugs, which are toxic and actually destroy the brain with long-term use. It actually shrinks the person's brain. Nobody's getting cured from any of these drugs. The antidepressants, the anti-anxiety drugs, a lot of them cause neurological damage with long-term use. Nobody's being cured of depression with antidepressant drugs. And the schizophrenics, those drugs just serve as a major tranquilizer. That's what they're called, major tranquilizers. They just dumb the person down. So, back in the day, the pharmaceutical industry keeps touting, the justifying the super exorbitant cost of their drugs by saying, yeah, we got to put in tons and tons of research. It's very expensive to find these drugs. They're making $4.7 billion, I think, a year selling antipsychotic drugs, which were discovered by accident starting in Germany, in a dye lab in Germany that made dyes. And then the French came and processed the essence of what the Germans had found, and it was phenothiazines were born. So they wanted to use those with mental patients in Europe, but at that time, psychoanalysis was in control of stuff, and they didn't allow it. So they came to the United States and went into a big psychiatric hospital there, administered these drugs to the patients, and found out that they became compliant, drugged down zombies. Didn't cause any trouble. Just wandered around listlessly and were super sedated. So basically what these drugs are chemical restraints or chemical straitjackets. They don't cure anything. Schizophrenia is not cured by these drugs. It's just managed.
Yeah, it's like patching. It's just like, you know what it kind of reminds me of? What it reminds me of is, I know this is a strange analogy, but it's like if I cut myself and then I took a painkiller so I didn't feel the pain, it doesn't mean that you're not bleeding, you just don't feel it. So it's kind of like what these drugs do is, like you said, they don't cure anything. They just sort of, yeah, zombify the pain. I mean, I remember when I was listening to you, you were talking about some of the practices that still go on, or maybe a couple of decades ago, in psychiatry and how they treat patients. And it was almost medieval when I was listening to it.
Yeah, that brings up the memory of the first shock treatment I ever saw at the first place I worked was the biggest psychiatric hospital on the planet. It was Central State Hospital in Central Georgia. And when I got there, there were 10,000 patients there. It was like a city. You know, it had its own food factory. It had its own, you know, medical system, medical hospital. It was a city. There were 10,000 patients there. It had, I think, 3,000 acres of land. And one day a friend of mine called me up, and I heard that they were giving shock treatments there, but I had never seen one. You know, I was aware of what they were. And, you know, I walked into, I got a call from a friend of mine in another unit, in another site, another unit. And he said, they're giving a shock treatment here in about an hour. You know, there's a bunch of students down there. You can come and watch if you want. Okay. So I hustled on over there and, you know, met my friend. We went down to where this was, and it was this big room with pillars. And here's a psychiatrist. I think he seemed to be a Cuban psychiatrist. He had a bunch of students around him, and it was clear that he was really enjoying the attention of all these students. And he's prattling on about you know, the shock treatment. And here was a wooden box on the table with a couple of dials on it and two knobs, and it was plugged into the wall. And then he started showing the electrodes. So these electrodes were like 2 inches by 2 inches, and there were two of them. You know, one went on one side of the head, one went on the other side of the head. And he was showing these off, and he was preparing them to be used. And he put this gel on them, and I asked him, well, what's that for? And he said, that's to conduct the electricity. If we didn't put that gel on there, the shock, the electricity would be so strong it would actually burn the patient. And I'm like, whoa. So he's telling about this thing, and you know, it's clear that he's getting off on being like the center of attention. And then he asked the nurse to bring in the patient, and in come this fragile old lady that was just skin and bones. And I looked at that and went, holy cow. And she was being escorted by two nurses, and there was a gurney that they led her up to the gurney, and she got on the gurney like, you know, she knew the drill. And then she laid there. Nobody told her to. She just knew to do it. They were treating her for depression. And then they started strapping her down with these 4-point straps on her wrist, on her legs, on her knees, on her chest. I mean, they were strapping her down super tight. And I'm like, I asked the psychiatrist again. I said, well, what are they doing that for? And he said, well, if they didn't do that when we administered the shock, when she convulsed from the shock, it would break her bones. You would snap her arms or leg bones. And you know, I'm thinking like, this is a treatment that snaps bones. And the next thing he did, he's prattling on to all these students, and he got this horse needle. It was like this big around, and it was about this long, and it was filled with this milky white liquid. And it looked like a horse needle. It was huge. So I asked him, I said, what is that? And why is it so big? And he said, that's muscle relaxer. You know, if we didn't give her the muscle relaxer, she would snap her bones. You know, so this poor lady's laying there, and this guy gets his horse needle, sticks it into her arm, and not only does he just inject it, he swishes it back and forth so the blood swirls within that tube. So he's mixing it with the blood already. And then he slowly puts it in her. You know, this whole big giant needle of stuff goes in her. And, you know, she gets real groggy, and she kind of halfway passes out. She's in a half awake state. And then he goes, okay, is everybody ready? And he said, move back away from the gurney, you know, because there's metal parts on the gurney. He didn't want anybody shocked who he didn't intend to shock. And he turns these dials, and then he pushes this switch, and she just starts bucking in those restraints like she was going to break them. I mean, this is this frail old lady, you know, just convulsing, and it was like horrible. And I'm shocked. I was just totally shocked watching this. And it just went on like it seemed forever. And then finally he turns off that machine, and she just goes dead still. And he's still flapping. He's still running his mouth, telling all these students he's getting off on the attention. And I'm looking at this old lady, and she's turning dark blue. She's turning cyanotic. She's dead. And I tell him, I said, hey, doctor, she's getting cyanotic. And almost like an afterthought, he goes, oh. And he gets these shock paddles, and he shocks her hard again. And then slowly she comes back to life in color again. And I've got a pretty strong stomach. I mean, but I've never seen anything like that. And when I went to walk out of that room, I almost fainted. I mean, I had to hold onto a pillar to keep from falling onto the floor. And they were given 3,000 of these a year at that hospital. They were used, matter of fact, they say they're used to treat depression and psychosis. Now, they did appear to get rid of the voices for maybe a few days or a week with psychotic people. You know, they say it helped a little bit with depression. But what I saw is they mostly used it for punishment. And it wasn't the psychiatrists who were ordering these shock treatments. It was the attendants on the wards. So they would tell the psychiatrist, hey, Johnny Q has been acting up all week. We think he needs another shock treatment.
So it was almost just like a way to get a break, pretty much, from their.
Well, they used it as punishment almost in a lot of cases. You know, and 3,000 of these. And I read an account of a neurologist who said that even after one of those shocks, he could see the brain damage it caused. And they were doing this time after time after time after time. This was normal operating procedure at that hospital. So the psychiatric mafia at work.
Yeah, it's crazy because I was listening. Again, like I said, I don't know if I mentioned this in the live stream, but I've listened to almost, like when I first heard, we're going to get into this, but when I first heard Jerry's material, it was kind of like the needle drop moment where I went, that makes sense. And when I look at how, for lack of a better word, and people understand this, sort of satanic that the psychiatry industry is, I kind of wonder, have these sort of entities gotten into the people's head to run it? Because I remember you were talking about, and I'll let you explain this, the gentleman that came, it was something to do with the rats and sort of spaghettifying their prefrontal cortex in order to just dumb these guys down. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yep. They call that a prefrontal lobotomy. You know, that was going on, I think, in the 20s and 30s. So what this one guy found was that he could get an ice pick type device, stick it in through the eye socket up to the prefrontal cortex, and just wiggle it around a few times, and it would pretty much sever the prefrontal cortex and turn the guy into a zombie. They even had what they called a lobotomy mobile that ran around the United States and visited different cities. this traveling doctor would do this, and he would administer these lobotomies, and it really screwed the person up for life. I mean, it was permanent neurological damage. Now with the violent ones, it calmed them down. I mean, back then they didn't. I don't think they had antipsychotic drugs then. So when he did that, they just became, sedate zombies. And I only met one of these that were left over from those days when I was at the state hospital. And I remember talking to him, and I remember the thought that went through my mind was he's not quite human. There was something, he just wasn't human anymore. I mean,
Can you put your finger on what it was exactly? Like what gave you that thought? Was it like his the discernment abilities, or like what? Do you know roughly what it was that kind of gave you that?
I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was just like you could tell he wasn't normal.
And how did he act? Like what was his?
Oh, he wasn't violent or anything like that because I carried on a conversation with him. Yeah. But I don't remember the exact details. I just remember that thought after speaking with him.
Yeah, it's crazy. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, he was the only one of those I met. I believe they've stopped that now, but they're still doing the shock treatments. They're not as nasty as they were back then. I mean, they control the voltage a lot better. And there's some people who say they have helped bring them out of psychosis. But from what I witnessed, they would make the voices disappear. That was interesting. The electricity would make the voices disappear for a period of time, maybe a few days. And I remember I think it was in the 1920s, there was a doctor who wrote 30 Years Among the Dead who would administer static shocks. Carl Wickland was his name.
Got it right here. I ordered it. I've not got through to it yet because my
yeah.
Awful, but,
so that was interesting because he would administer these static shocks, and the voices experienced those static shocks as a lightning storm. They found them very unpleasant. His wife was a psychic, and she would take these voices and she would talk them into the light. And once they went into the light, they were gone. That one was gone. And I remember I was working with a clinical psychologist at that time who also realized that these voices were not hallucinations. He would carry on conversations with them. He worked up in Northern California. And I got in touch with him, and we just hit it off because the two of us were seeing the same thing. I remember he told me one time that he gave independently, he gave a series of tests, an MMPI, a Rorschach, and something else to the patient himself and to the patient's voices. So he gave the patient the instruction, I want you to take this. I don't want the voices to have any part of it. And then he got the voices permission to work with them, and the voices took it. And he said the results were that the voices were much more psychotic than the patient.
That's very interesting. So I'm going to take this in sort of a linear fashion and just run through this story. I tell you something, because I understand the majority of people who are watching this is the first time they've seen Jerry. You could write your story. It would come across as like a fiction novel.
Yeah. If I didn't experience it, I still wouldn't believe it. If I hadn't gone through it, I wouldn't believe it.
And we'll touch on that because if you look at the Bible, the Quran, I think in the world, Christians and Muslims combined make up half the world's population. And despite the fact that both the books talk about, the Christian idea of demons, which seem to be just solely evil, and then you have the Quranic idea of the jinn, which they're more free will oriented. There can be good ones, there can be bad ones, but even when presented with the information that people are watching this are going to be presented with, you're going to feel a sense of shock, which is kind of interesting because it's like we've replaced knowledge from thousands and thousands of years with this very new Einstein-y sort of trademark, the science, where everything's material and chaotic, and it kind of allows these entities to go unseen. Because if you're in this mind view of everything's material, you know, big explosion and you're spinning around and evolution and all this stuff, you can't really have room for this.
You hit it right on the head. You hit it right on the head.
Yeah, and it's
interesting.
interesting.
That's exactly what's happening.
Exactly, and I think that's why these things are just running rampant. I mean, I'm not going to butt in too much during this, but just I'm 22 and I'm looking at what my future's like, and if you look at what's going on with the Fed printer and what's going on with the education system, to how much debt there is, the cost of living, the wars that are going on, you're like, who really is benefiting from this? I personally take my theology from the Quran, but there's one thing that Paul said in the Bible. He said that our battle is not with flesh and blood; it's with principalities of darkness. And
Exactly.
people will read that and they'll go. It's kind of like they'll pay lip service to it. They'll go, yeah, no, okay, next, and then they'll go on their phone and scroll TikTok. And it's only once you get evidence like what you're about to see in this episode that you're like, oh, that isn't a metaphor, you know? So one of the big things that I uncovered with that was kind of just for, you know, excuse my language, but full of shit, was the educational system. And I know I do this thing where you trace the money. When you look at these sort of idols or celebrities that leave their money, when they die, they never leave their money to their kids. They always leave it to a charity. And then you trace who owns the charity, and it's the people who gave them the money to propagate whatever agenda they're looking to fuel. And if you look at, like you were saying, these the universities you would have went through that are Rockefeller funded, probably the psychiatry and drug, the drug psychiatric mafia is probably owned by the same people who are funding the education system. So it's like you go through their school to learn their thing, so then you can buy their drugs. So give me a run through, and with the people watching, what the education system told you and how you managed to discern slowly over time that this is a lie, that was a lie, and then how the story unfolded.
Well, I want to go back and kind of highlight what you said about people just blowing off these demons.
Yeah.
So in the Bible, there's like 23 times it mentions that Jesus cast out demons.
Yeah.
So here, the U.S. and Scotland, I mean, these are Christian societies.
Yep.
They're treating that like, oh yeah, that's a 2,000-year-old fairy tale. You know, that's just these people, you know, Stone Age people back there, you know, making up this stuff that's not being made up.
Yeah, it's not.
It's very real. Matter of fact, you look at in the past 200 years, over 100 million people on this planet lost their lives due to war. Over a span of 3,358 years, only 237 of those years were peaceful.
It's crazy.
That's crazy. That's because of the action of these entities.
Yep.
You know, the biggest lie that people have ever consumed is that the devil and these demons don't exist.
Yeah, 100%.
You know? That's like being, you know, locking yourself into a dark room with rattlesnakes and going, oh yeah, somebody told me there's rattlesnakes in here, but I don't hear them.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's exactly what it is. And if you, I mean, I one of the big gripes I have, and I'm glad I can speak with you about this, because I'd imagine, and I know because I've listened to you, but when you were going through your practices, as soon as you start to, and I'm not trying to sound like a new ager here, but as soon as you start to think for yourself, you'll start to realize people get very annoyed very quickly. And I go, oh, so why? So when you were going through and you would ask the patients what the voices were, people would get very annoyed with you. And that's been a theme of, I know I've not lived anywhere near as long as you, but I've noticed that theme myself. I go, this doesn't make sense. And there's sort of an irrational reaction from people where they shouldn't really care, but they get so frivolently aggressive that you discern something yourself. One of the big problems I have, and I've looked down this rabbit hole, is sort of is the history of humanity that's fed to people today. And this quote unquote science, which is all theoretical and based on not the scientific method, but sort of an appeal to authority, appeal to consensus thing, of that you're from an explosion and a rock hit a rock in a vacuum where God can't hear your thoughts, and the sun's going to burn out and everything you know is going to die, and you're here by chance. If you adopt that mentality, there is no room for this unseen realm. If you have this idea that there's these little minions floating about, and if we don't inject you with something, which most likely will give you heart conditions, then you're going to die. When you adopt that frame of thinking, and as well, when you take the history that people are taught now, and you extrapolate back 1,000 years, these young people, especially me, you're told, oh yes, back in those days, everything was so terrible. I mean, you had big cathedrals and no crime, and everyone was civilized. But now that you had an iPhone 13 last year and an iPhone 14 this year, and you're about to get a new Tesla model, therefore everything's getting better. So just ignore everything from a while ago as outdated, medieval, cult nonsense. But now, because you have an electric car, you're making linear progress and everything's great. When you adopt that mentality, and for me it's a form of brainwashing, there is no room for the unseen. So if you take a young Christian boy and he reads the Bible, and like you said, he sees, if you take the story about Jesus on the mountain where he's tempted by the devil for 40 years, but then he also has somebody in his ear from a Rockefeller schooling system going, no, Jesus couldn't exist, the devil isn't real, it's all chaos and explosions and all this. You can't have both at the same time. And I think it leads people to, like you were just saying, they just kind of see it as metaphor. They'll pay lip service to it, but as soon as somebody annoys them, they get aggravated with the person, etc., etc. So that was just my little interjection there, but I'll let you continue.
Well, yeah, we're spiritual beings. That's all there is to it. I mean, if your spirit leaves your body, you're dead. That's all there. Yeah. Black and white. You know. So, we're affected by spiritual systems, and these negative entities are around us all the time. These jinn, these demons, they go after the weakest first. But boy, they're around, and that's exactly what the psychotic voices are. When I was in college, they taught us that, oh yeah, the voices are hallucinations. They didn't ever describe them. They didn't do any research on them. It was like the Psychiatric Mafia just stood up and went, we are the psychiatrists, and we hereby pronounce that the voices are hallucinations. We say so. That's all there is to it. They haven't done any research on it whatsoever. So here's the textbooks that, I'm being forced to digest, and they're talking about the voices being hallucinations. So when you think about a hallucination, you think it's some pandemonium stuff going all over the place, like verbal salad or something, just this concoction of insanity. But that's not how it was. So, when I first went to work at the state hospital, I was hearing these people talk to their voices, and they were carrying on conversations with them, logical conversations with them. They were arguing with them. They were debating with them. They were communicating with them in full sentences. But what it was like was watching somebody talking on the telephone, where you only could hear one side of the conversation. You couldn't hear the other side. Okay. And that didn't make sense in terms of what I believe, because they didn't talk about hallucinations much in college or graduate school or in the PhD program. They just basically said these things are hallucinations. So I became curious, like, okay, what are these things telling them? Nobody, when I got to this hospital, there were, I probably staff in the thousands. I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, at least in the many hundreds. It was the size of a city, and nobody I saw was the least bit curious as to what these voices were or what they were saying to the patients, except me. And I would ask them. I'd ask the psychiatrists, I'd ask the psychiatric nurses, I'd ask the attendants. It's like, well, what are these voices and what are they telling these people? They go, well, they're hallucinations. Who knows what they're telling them? They weren't the least bit curious.
Can I interject quickly? I don't know. I'm trying not to interject because the story's amazing. But why do you think that is? Because I can't wrap my head around why people just aren't interested.
Well, they're brainwashed before they get there
by
the educational system, just like I was. When I first got there, I believed they were hallucinations, but I thought the hallucinations were like word salad, They were all over the place. I mean, because that's how hallucinations are. They're all over the place. Some are positive, some are negative, some are neutral. I mean, they're just, So that's what I thought they were, because that's kind of what I was taught in school. And there wasn't any detail in all the classes I took. There wasn't any detail about what the hallucinations were, or how they behaved, or what they looked like, or what they sounded like, or if they ran any patterns. There wasn't any information about them. It was just their hallucinations. You treated them with drugs. Now, I saw myself that traditional counseling, talking to a schizophrenic, trying to counsel them with traditional methods, was like shooting a rhino in the butt with a BB rifle. It just didn't work. The only thing I saw, and this is back in the 70s, is when I was working at this state hospital. The only thing that did seem to affect those voices were these antipsychotic medications. They would quiet them down. In most cases, they wouldn't get rid of them. In the large majority of cases, they would not get rid of the voices. The patient still heard them, but it was like getting drunk when you're injured. You get drunk and you're still injured, but it doesn't bother you as much. So that's what they were doing. They were dousing these guys down with, these meds, and they were just turning them into zombies. Now the psychiatric rehabilitation center I worked with, we were trying to get these people out of the hospital and get them working. The problem was they wouldn't stay on their psych drugs. They all eventually went off them at some point. So the psychiatric center and the treatment team I was working with, it gave them three chances. If they went off their drugs 3 times, we determined, like, okay, these drugs are the only thing we have to keep the psychosis under control. It's their only chance of functioning half normally. And if they keep going off them, when we release them, they're not going to stay on them either. Right? So after they went off 3 times, we'd usually discharge them. So I watched, and time after time after time, they kept going off these drugs. Now, the side effect of those drugs are awful. They're just awful. They're toxic. These drugs are very toxic. I have a big listing of side effects here somewhere, but they just go on and on and on for pages. It's like these advertisements you see on TV for these drugs. Well, it can kill you. It can cause bleeding. It can cause stroke. And it shows this guy smiling on the screen like he's happy to be taking this crap. I was like, it's the same thing with these drugs. I've lost my train of thought where I was going with this now. But they kept going off these drugs. The side effects were awful. So you could see why they would go off based on the side effects alone, because they were awful side effects. Nobody in their right mind would want to be on these drugs. And people not in their right mind don't want to be on these drugs either. So they quit. So I did an experiment once with everybody who went off of these drugs. I asked them, I got a description from the DSM, psychosis and all the bad factors about being psychotic. And they were horrible. I mean, seeing monsters, hallucinating, injuring yourself, the paranoia, things coming at you at the night, the shadow, all this horrible stuff. I mean, it's like a nightmare. Okay. And then I bring these guys in who went off their drugs, and I say, okay, tell me all the negative side effects you had from your drugs. Okay. Not all of them had the same side effects. So I asked them, what side effects did you have? And, they had a handful, maybe a little more than a handful of side effects that they really didn't like: sexual dysfunction, grogginess, blurred vision, just agitation and sedation at the same time. I mean, these drugs are toxic, and those side effects are the toxic side effects of these drugs. Okay? They weren't good. So I gave them a sheet of paper. I said, write down all the negative side effects you had on these drugs. And they'd write down, 5 or 6. And then I'd take that back and I'd give them this check sheet of all the negative symptoms of being psychotic. A big page full of them. I said, check all these symptoms here that you've had when you were in a psychotic state. And they checked those, and those were very awful too. And then I hand both sheets back to him, and I said, which is worse? 100% said that this being psychotic was worse than the side effects. Every single one of them. Dozens of them. Mm. So and then I'd ask him, well, then why'd you go off your drugs? Do you want to be psychotic? Well, why did you quit taking your drugs? Every single one of them said, I don't know. Mm. That went on for 3 years. Mm-hmm. I kept doing that for 3 years and never got an answer. After 7 years at the hospital, the last year I was there, within the last 6 months, I found the answer to that. Now, another thing I noticed when I was working at the state hospital is that psychiatrists were being assaulted at a rate higher than any other staff at that hospital. Higher than doctors, higher than nurses, higher than psych nurses, higher than counselors, higher than psychologists, higher than any other staff, psych techs. The only body of workers that were being assaulted at about the same rate were the attendant staff, who were with these people 24 hours a day. And psychiatrists were with them maybe 15, 20 minutes a month. And I was like, what are these people saying? What are the psychiatrists saying to these psychotic guys that are causing them to beat them up when they're only with them 15 minutes a month? Didn't make any sense to me. So there was one gal who she went off her meds 3 times. She was about to be discharged. And her mother calls me when we notified the mother, and mother was just begging me, please don't discharge her. I can't deal with her. I can't handle her. I'll come up there and we'll find out why she isn't taking her meds, and we'll work on it together. I said, well, okay. All right. Come on up. She was in South Georgia, so she was like 4 hours away. So she drove up one Friday. We brought the patient into the room. We brought her into the room. And both me and the mother were asking this gal, you went off your meds 3 times. You're about to be discharged. Why did you do that? You knew you were going to be discharged if you went off your meds a 3rd time, and you did it anyway. And she says, well, I don't. You won't believe me. You won't believe me. I said, well, try me. I've heard some pretty strange stuff since I've been working here. I don't think you can shock me with anything. And she goes, well, the voices told me that these drugs were poisoning me, and that the psychiatrist was poisoning me. And they pointed to the side effects of these drugs as the result of me being poisoned. And they convinced me that I was being poisoned because I was feeling all these side effects. And it was true. She was being poisoned slowly by these drugs. So it clicked in my head at that point. This is why psychiatrists are being beat up at such a rate. They're the ones prescribing these drugs. you know. And the voices don't like that. I found out later the voices don't like these drugs. They want the person as upset and miserable and paranoid and anxious as possible because they feed off of that negative emotional energy.
Mm.
That's another thing I saw, you know, starting at the state hospital, is that before the voices attacked, these guys seemed to have plenty of energy. After the voices attacked them, they didn't have any. And that was, there's a one-to-one correspondence all the way through all the years I worked with schizophrenics. So, you know, I was thinking, well, I asked some of these guys what the voices told them, and it's horrible stuff. It's you're no good, you're rotten, you're ugly, you're stupid, nobody loves you, you're never going to succeed at anything. I mean, it's the most horrible stuff that you could ever hear. These voices were telling these people, and it was consistently negative. It was nothing good. So I thought, well, it must be that. I mean, if I was listening to that 24 hours a day, I would probably be drained also. And that's what I thought was happening for years so I worked for 7 years at this large state hospital. Then I went back to school for the work on a PhD. I could only deal with that for 2 years before I couldn't take it anymore, because I'd already spent 7 years working at the state hospital, and I saw what these people were teaching me, and it didn't mesh with what I was seeing on the front lines. It didn't look like it was going to help anything. You know, it was all this theory and all this other stuff, but it wasn't helping people, and I could see it wasn't going to. So, you know, when I left, I started off working at a hospital emergency room, and then some mental health centers. And eventually, I took a job with the prison because it was more secure, with the prison psychology department. Okay. It was there one day that I saw that that energy drain wasn't due to the negative stuff these voices were saying. Okay? So they put me over the worst units at the prison all the time, and that was okay with me because I was an adrenaline junkie anyway. If I wasn't an adrenaline junkie, I probably wouldn't have done any of this stuff, you know. So it was a bit scary, but it was exciting, and that was my adrenaline high. I mean, I got my adrenaline high from working with psychotics, and in the prison it was, you know, psychotic killers at times. So what had happened, I walked into my office one day, and I'm just going to go forward for a while, and then I'm going to regress again because of this one point, the energy loss. Okay? It's a consistent trait that anybody can see. You know, anybody who works around schizophrenics will see after the voices attack, these guys don't have any energy. And you ask those guys, where'd that energy go? They didn't use it. You know, they're laying in their bed all night, tossing and turning, listening to the voices. They're not using a lot of energy. They're not using physical energy. So I'd ask them, I said, well, where'd your energy go? And the consistent answer was, I don't know. I don't know. You know? But they would verify that before the voices came, and I measured this too, 1 to 10 scale. You know, how much energy do you feel you had before the voices attacked? How much energy do you have after they attacked? And it was consistently less after the voices attacked them. So I think we ran an analysis of variance on the results, and it came out as statistically significant. Whatever was happening, there was the chances that it was not due to chance were, you know, like 1 in 1,000. You know, it was not due to chance. And but the patients didn't know why that was. So there was one time I was assigned to the jail for the prison, where the worst of the worst went. These were 2-man cells, stacked up on top of one another, very small cells, like 10 by 10. You know, they had they stayed in there most of the day. They came out for one hour. They were put out in a fenced yard where they could get some sunlight. That was it. So I walked into my office one morning in another unit, and here's a inmate letter from one inmate going, My roommate's nuts. He's completely psychotic. He's talking to voices all night. He's pacing the floor all night. He doesn't sleep. He woke me up the other night and he's standing over me, just looking at me in the dark. You got to do something about this guy. He's freaking me out. And yeah, of course, he couldn't talk to him. The guy's deranged. Apparently, he wasn't on any medications. So I looked up the patient who was psychotic, and I looked up the guy who wrote the letter. And he was there because he snitched off the Aryan Brotherhood, which is a violent gang in the prison. They had a drug deal. He snitched them off. They wanted him dead. They've already stabbed him once. So they put that guy into this cell for protective custody. That's why he was there. The drug gang wanted him dead so bad that some of their members got in trouble on purpose to be sent to the CDU, the Central Detention Unit, to get this guy. So they were already there in some of the other cells, but they didn't let them all out at once. They let a couple out at once. That was it. And it was usually from the same cell. So they were sticking notes under his door saying, we're here. We're going to get you. You're a dead man. First chance we get, we're going to get you. So you'd already been stabbed by them once. And here they were, wanted him dead so bad that they actually got in trouble to get over to that CDU to get him. Now I looked up the other guy, and he was completely psychotic. He was off medications. He was, floridly psychotic. He was crazy as a bedbug. Okay? And they were in this little 10 by 10 cell together. So for the guy who wasn't psychotic, you couldn't be under too much more stress than that, except on the front lines in a battlefield. You're locked in this 10 by 10 cell with a floridly psychotic. Who knows what he was there for? He could have killed somebody. The gangsters were trying to get the psychotic guy to kill this guy. So that was going on. And here he was locked in there with this guy. So you couldn't be under much more stress. So I was thinking it was stress that caused this. This loss of energy. So I went over then, I talked to him one after the other. And I talked to the guy who was there for protective custody first, and I watched him come up the steps to the control room. He had plenty of energy. He bounded up the steps. He didn't have to use the guardrails. He walked briskly over to the interview room. He sat down. He was erect. He was nervous. You could tell he was depressed, but he had plenty of energy. So he wasn't slumped over. His speech was normal. It wasn't, wasn't slow. It wasn't hyper. He had plenty of energy. So after I was done with him, he went back to the cell, and then I brought up the psychotic guy, and he barely made it up the steps. He was very slow. He was using the handrails. He shuffled along the catwalk over to the interview room. He sat down. He slumped in the chair. You could tell he had no energy. And asked him, "You hearing voices?" He said, "Yeah, I'm hearing them all the time, just constantly." And I asked him, "How's your energy level?" And he admitted it was down in the dumps. Okay? After I got done with those two guys, I walked out of there and I went, "It's not the negativity of the voices. There's something else going on here." So. It was like there's nobody I could talk to about this stuff. It's like I'm poking around in these guys' heads, and there's nobody to talk to. If the psychiatrist found I was doing that, or if my supervisors found out I was doing that, I'd probably be in trouble. So I just kept it to myself. I went, well, that wasn't the cause, and I thought for decades that it was. So. Now this, I don't want to get. This trails from that point on, but let me stop there, and pick up on that later, because I want to pick up on some other stuff that's very important that I found earlier. Okay. Now, when I first started working with these guys, I saw patterns emerging. Okay. So I'd talk to them about their voices, and it probably took me a year to get to the point where I figured out how to talk to these guys about their voices. And because they don't call them paranoid schizophrenics for nothing. They don't trust psych staff, because, the psych staff were basically snitches for psychiatry. And so they would kind of monitor the behavior of these patients. And if somebody was getting too crazy, they'd snitch them off to psychiatry. Psychiatry would drug them. That's basically what we were doing. So they didn't trust psych staff. And it took like a year to kind of learn how to talk to them. And I would ask them questions about the voices, and I would learn it piece by piece. It would just like maybe once every couple of months, a new aspect of the voices would come up, and I would collect these like gems. So when I talked to a new schizophrenic patient who came on the unit, I would ask him about the voices, and they wouldn't talk. And I said, well, I know this, and this about them already. What else can you tell me? Now, that was much more than any of the other staff knew, even though it was a minuscule amount. And they saw that I was interested in learning about these things. And a lot of them were interested in what they were too, because they didn't know what they were. They experienced them, but they didn't know what they were. So slowly, piece by piece, I was getting this list of patterns and characteristics of these voices. And one day I was talking to one patient, and he was aggravated that I was asking him these questions. So he went to one of the psychiatrists, and he told the psychiatrist, this guy's asking me questions about the voices, and it upsets me. It was the voices that were upset. It wasn't him that was upset. So I ended up being called into that psychiatrist's office and ordered to stop asking questions about the voices. So the psychiatrist said the voices are hallucinations. When you're asking questions about them to these patients, you're reinforcing these hallucinations, and you're making them worse. He ordered me to stop asking questions to the patients about these voices.
It's always a telltale sign when there's something up, is when you get in trouble for asking questions. You can always tell there's something being hidden there.
So that happened twice. I had to be very careful at the state hospital, because, like I told you before, these patients, the schizophrenics, were beating up psychiatrists. They didn't want them provoked. And the unwritten rule at the state hospital was you don't provoke any schizophrenic any more than you absolutely have to. And only if the situation is dire. So I had to fly under the radar with them there. But I started learning that these voices, this is what I got done while at the state hospital. These were the first patterns that I saw. Was one, that the voices were consistently negative. They weren't positive ever. It was always negative. So the question I asked myself is, what holds them on a consistently negative pattern? Why aren't they like other hallucinations, where sometimes they're positive, sometimes they're negative, sometimes they're neutral, and everything in between? How come they're consistently negative, and what holds them to that pattern? It reminded me of, there was a movie, I think it was called The Enemy Below, where a World War II destroyer was chasing a German U-boat. And from time to time, the destroyer would lose the U-boat. But the U-boat always went back onto a specific course. Mm-hmm. So the captain of the destroyer, when he lost the U-boat, would just go onto that course again until he caught up with him. Okay? It was the same thing with this negativity. It was always a consistently negative course. It never varied from it. It was a pattern, and it was a pattern with all of them, not just a few. The voices from every single one I talked to were consistently negative. They were insulting, abusive, destructive. They might have helped for short periods of time, but it was only to kind of get the trust of the patient. and then once they hooked them, then they would abuse them some more. So they would invariably turn on them later. That was consistent. It was the first consistent pattern I saw. And I'm thinking, if these things are running patterns, then they cannot be hallucinations. Okay. Now, the Psychiatric Mafia and Big Pharma didn't want anything like this coming out. So they were first they blamed mothers for schizophrenia. Well, the mothers did something wrong. They raised their kids wrong. They beat them. They talked to them wrong. They're the ones that caused schizophrenia. But everybody could see that.
Mm-hmm.
You know? So they couldn't have any of that. They had to have something where people couldn't investigate it. Right? So they kicked it up to genetics. They said, "Oh, it's a genetic disorder. It's something's genetically wrong," because it does seem to follow a pattern that there tends to be schizophrenics and schizophrenics families, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's genetic.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what the phrase is. Causation doesn't equal correlation.
It could be learned. All right. So. I got a call coming in to distract me. I'll just ignore it.
This is pre-recorded, so if you ever need to take a break or anything, just let me know.
No, I'm good.
You were talking
about. Where was it?
It's thrown me off as well.
Okay, so it was the negativity of the voices and the cause for schizophrenia. So they blamed it on the mothers, then they blamed it on genetics, and then when the geneticist, they got away with that for probably decades. It's a genetic disorder, because who's going to disprove that? People on the front lines aren't going to do it. Psychiatrists aren't going to do it. Psychologists aren't going to do it. Regular medical doctors aren't going to do it. It's got to be geneticists. And there's a very small group, and of that small group, there's even a smaller group that is probably interested in schizophrenia.
And
but eventually,
funding this research.
Yeah, and who's funding the research? Because of the deep state and the Psychiatric Mafia and Big Pharma are not going to fund research like that. No way. So somebody did, and they did not find any genetic link to schizophrenia. So then they started coming out like, oh well, it's not just one genetic link. It's a bunch of genetic links. So we'll just complicate the situation like a jigsaw puzzle, all mixed up, and it's all these pieces, and you can't prove otherwise, which is true. The majority of the human race can't prove that, but it was later disproved by these similar honest geneticists who knows where they got their funding, but it wasn't from Big Pharma. Right? So. Once they did that, then they were like, okay, we need something else. We need to. We don't know what the cause is. We need some other cause. So then they went to the chemical imbalance theory. All right. That was fabricated by Eli Lilly in, I think, the early 70s when they came up with Prozac. Mm-hmm. It was a lie at the time.
Well, Eli, eh? Yeah, you always
Eli.
Very well.
So this chemical imbalance theory was working at the state hospital. I watched these psychiatrists deal with these patients. Never did I ever see them give any kind of lab test, EEG, EKG, any kind of objective test to find out what chemicals in their brain were out of balance or by how much. It didn't happen. So I'm like, okay, if it's a chemical imbalance, you would think they would want to know what's out of balance and by how much to counter it. Wasn't happening. I never ever saw them give any kind of lab work or anything. So I'd ask them, I'd say, well, okay, if this is a chemical imbalance, how do you know what's out of balance and by how much? Because you're not given any tests. I asked one of the psychiatrists. He goes, oh, the pharmaceutical industry has done all that for us. We just use their drugs. And I'm like, it just boggled my mind. It's like letting the hen in the fox in the hen house, and these guys were clueless. It turned out that not only did they not have any proof of a chemical imbalance in the brain, they didn't have any test for it either. It didn't exist. They didn't even know what the chemical balance of the brain should be to call it an imbalance. It was all fabricated. It's a lie that they perpetuated on the entire planet, and they're making billions of dollars off this lie. And they're still pushing it. Now they changed the wording a little bit, but this was from the Cleveland Clinic not too long ago. Says this is one of their advertisements. The title was "What Causes Schizophrenia and Does It Have Any Triggers?" It starts off with schizophrenia doesn't have a single confirmed cause. Experts suspect several different factors play a role. The number one was chemical imbalance in your brain. The chemicals involved with the communication between cells. Right. So they're still pushing it. Yeah, even though it's been disproved, they're still pushing it.
Yeah, they just use the term expert as an appeal to authority, and then people's ignorance for not looking into it, and just they just brush it under the rug.
Yeah, it's like, take our word for it. We're the authorities, So here's one psychiatrist said there's not a single peer-reviewed article that can be accurately cited to directly support claims of serotonin deficiency in any mental disorder, while there are many articles that present a counter evidence. Jeffrey LaCrosse, he wrote that serotonin and depression, a disconnect between advertisements and scientific literature. Ronald Pies, now this guy was he was a psychiatrist and a predominant one. He was emeritus of the Psychiatric Times. Okay? So he stated the demise of the chemical imbalance theory. He said, in view of the mounting evidence against it, after more than 20 years of being told a chemical imbalance in the brain causes mental illness, such as anxiety disorder, depression, etc., the theory was finally put to rest when Ronald Pies, the editor-in-chief of and emeritus of the Psychiatric Times, stated on July 11, 2011, of the issue of the Times, I don't believe I have ever heard a knowledgeable, well-trained psychiatrist make such a preposterous claim that mental patients have a chemical imbalance, except perhaps to mock it. In truth, the chemical imbalance notion was always a kind of urban legend, never a theory seriously propounded by well-informed psychiatrists. Okay? So the next time a doctor tells any of you guys who go to a psychiatrist that you have a mental illness or depression and it's due to a chemical imbalance in the brain, ask him where the lab tests are to prove that. He won't have any. So They're still pushing this lie today, and they got the whole planet believing that mental illness is due to a physical chemical imbalance of the brain. It has nothing to do with spirituality or spirits or negative entities or demons or the devil. They got you focused on a physical manifestation. It's like it's similar to pouring Thorazine on a magnetic field, and expecting the magnetic field to dissipate. The magnetic field is energy. So are thoughts, so are hallucinations, so is memory, so is feelings. All that is energy. Your spirit is energy. It's not physical. We are physical beings. These bodies are like spacesuits, but the person who lives inside that drives these, like we drive a car, is not physical.
Yeah, 100%. And you can extrapolate that across pretty much everything that they claim under the site. I mean, what was ironic is the term, and everyone will know this from a couple years ago, from 2020 to 2022. I think everyone can read between the lines. The term "the science" is a trademark, like McDonald's or Coca-Cola. It's a trademarked term. And if you look at everything that alludes to that sort of everything's physical, it's all just a theory that's never been proved. I mean, and physicians, you can speak to a physics expert and ask him, can you give me a paper which isolates and proves something as simple as gravity? And they don't have anything. Like, there's nothing there. And once you go down that rabbit hole of looking at the science and their theory, I mean, it's called theoretical science for a reason. When it comes to medicine, to cosmology, everything, it's just lumped under the label theory, and they just assume that you'll never question it because you've been programmed by the schooling system to, when the bell goes off and when the person of authority in the uniform tells you something, you follow it.
Yeah,
so
exactly right.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Exactly right. You know, we're the high priest of mental health. You know, it reminds me of the high priest back in ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
You know, taking control of everything. Then psychiatrists are like the high priests of mental health. So, you know, WebMD. Now you go on the internet. WebMD is schizophrenic genetic. You know, it starts off with, think of your genes as a blueprint for your body. If there's a change to these instructions, it can sometimes increase your odds for developing diseases like schizophrenia.
Hmm.
And then they go, doctors don't think there's just one schizophrenic gene because that had already been disproven. Instead, they think it takes many genetic changes or mutations to have a mental illness. And then they go on to say studies show that neurotransmitters are neither too active or not active enough in people with schizophrenia. So here they're still trying to make the case for a physical remedy. You know, the voices are not physical. They run patterns. So the negativity was the first pattern I saw working at the state hospital. The voices were consistently negative. My question was, what holds them on such a consistently negative pattern? Why aren't they random? If they're hallucinations, why aren't they random like all other hallucinations? You know, there's a first pattern showed up there. Okay? Second pattern showed up was that they were anti-religious. I had one patient come to me and he said he repeats the 23rd Psalm to try to ward these things off. He said that the voices react to the 23rd Psalm like worms thrown on a hot frying pan. So when I heard that, I started asking other patients, well, what happens when you read the Bible? What happens when you go to church? You know, what happens when you read the 23rd Psalm? And the results were consistent. The voices reacted in a very negative manner. You know, to the 23rd Psalm, they can't stand it. It was like burning them with a blowtorch. And I would hand out copies of the 23rd Psalm and ask patients to come back and report to me what happened, how the voices reacted to them. It was always a negative reaction. So I started asking them, well, what happens when these are patients who hear voices? What happens when you go to church? It broke down into three distinct areas. One, if the voices were weak, they would shut up when the person went into the church. If they were moderate in strength, they would get louder and try to drown out what the preacher was trying to say. Right? So the patient had a hard time concentrating on the sermon with this thing blabbing at him all the time. You know? And it was like, oh, this guy's stupid, he's crazy, he's, you know, negative stuff about the preacher the whole time. If the voices were very strong, they would drive the person out. He would actually get up and run out of the church.
Mm.
Okay. So I found out they're consistently anti-religious. They don't want the person reading the Bible. They don't want them going to church. They don't want them following any kind of positive spiritual path, including Islam. If the patient repeats any kind of prayer, they go nuts about it. And this was consistent. Every single one of them who heard voices. You know, one guy was reading the Bible and the voice said to him, Jesus couldn't even save himself. What makes you think he's going to save you? And here's another thing I found interesting was the patients who felt intuitively that reading the Bible might help them. They kept doing it. Then the voices convinced them. They said, okay, if you're going to read the Bible, you got to read it from cover to cover. And the patient usually went, okay, I'll do that. So they started reading it, and they got to the place in the Bible where this guy begot that guy who begot, and it goes on for pages of who begot who. And then the voices would show up while the persons were trying to read that and going, well, look at this. This is a bunch of rubbish. Why are you even reading this? Why are you wasting your time? Who cares about who begot who? This is a bunch of crap. Why are you wasting your time? And that has happened over and over and over.
Yeah. It's that constant gaslighting. I mean, I'll give my own personal anecdote. I think for people who, like, if someone's listening and they're working, the 23rd Psalm is something like, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, or the Lord is my shepherd, I will fear not in the valley of darkness, something along those lines. And I've always actually, and this is again one of the reasons that when I first came across your stuff, I kind of obsessed over it. I kind of like fangirled a bit for about 10 days straight. Every time before I went, you wouldn't, it's probably the wisest thing to do, and we'll get into it when it gets dark. But actually, it was funny because I just newly got married and living with my wife. And I'd be like, okay, it's time to go to bed. I put my little earphones in and be listening to all these demon stuff. And I've always had this little inner monologue going on. Just like constantly, you'll be walking around and in your head, you think it's you, and it's like, well, I'll go to the gym, and then, oh, well, maybe you, and I started doing that, and we'll get into there's a procedure that I think you've kind of created that involves a couple of different things, but I would just start, and that's a lie thing. We'll get into that. And whenever something negative would come into my head, I'd go, that's a lie, and I'd insult it. I'd say something sarcastic, and then I'd say either the 23rd Psalm or the throne verse in the Quran. And I repeated that process for about a day. And I started for the first time, and I'm not just saying this because it sounds cool and it's pleasing on the ear and it goes along with what we're saying and it validates it. This is what happened. That for the first time since I was like, I don't know, 9, I was just able to sit there and not think of anything. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. It's very convenient, so yeah.
Yeah. Emanuel Swedenborg, psychiatry, psychology, the educational system, they don't ask where thoughts come from. That has never come up in, 8 years of education, the higher education I've had in the undergraduate, graduate, or doctoral program. It has never come up. Nobody asks the question, where do thoughts come from?
Crazy, because you can sit there. If you sit there when you're going to bed, I mean, what is meditation? You just sit and you actively have to try and think of nothing, which implies that your intention is to think of nothing, but you can't, because it's like, it's not you. I got Heaven and Hell here from Sweden. I've not read it yet. I'm going to get through it. But you can sit and you can watch these things come in and then go again. I mean, and we'll get into this, but I had an analogy on some of the videos I was talking about where I haven't drank alcohol in about 15, 16 months or something. But if you look at the word alcohol, it comes from the Arabic word al-kuhul, which means flesh-eating spirit. And I went, oh, that's interesting. And then you look at, you'll have your gin and tonic. It sounds a lot like gin in your spirit cupboard. And so it's a flesh-eating spirit, and you drink your spirits and your gin. That's interesting.
Well, it actually does dissolve your stomach. That's where alcoholic ulcers come from. Yeah. Alcohol is a solvent.
Yeah.
And I've seen alcoholics where it dissolved their throat. Yeah. They died from the blood vessels rupturing in their throat. I've seen alcoholics where the alcohol actually dissolved the mucus lining in their stomach and actually rotted out their stomach. So what you're saying is technically true. With enough alcohol. It is a flesh-eating spirit.
Well, I think as well, when you drink, and I observed this is one of the reasons I quit, and I've been saying this for a while. When you're sober, I don't know if you've ever done this, you go to a club or a pub or something, and you're sober, and you go in, and there's like a 6'8" bouncer, and you're like, not going near you, and there's maybe a couple women that aren't particularly well chased, let's say, and you're like, not going near them, and then you'll have a couple flesh-eating spirits, your alcohol, and maybe some gin, aptly worded, and maybe some more spirits. And then after half an hour, you're like, okay, the 6'8" bouncer, I'm going to fight him. And then the woman that's not well chased, I'm going to bring her back to my house. And you don't logically think it. but you do it anyway. It just comes to you. And I use the analogy, it's kind of like you drop to a certain frequency where the thoughts that are coming into your head are from this sort of demonic level. And I don't know if you ever considered this, but do you know when people, after they're like hammered and they wake up the next day and you're like, you realize that you battered that girl's boyfriend and then tried to make out with her in front of him. He's like, I didn't do that. That wasn't me. I'm like, I don't remember that.
They call that a blackout.
Yeah, and I'm like, oh, you don't remember it, and it wasn't you. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it wasn't you who was doing it. Something you vacated yourself. It's almost like it became too poisonous in your body that your consciousness left, and the void was filled with a alcohol, a flesh-eating spirit. You know what I mean? So just little things like that. It's like
I've had patients that went into those kind of blackouts and drove to another city, came to in the other city, and didn't even realize how they got there.
Yeah.
I had one guy. Now this guy was hearing voices, and he went into a bar, like you're talking about, where goes in there and the voices, and he's looking at all these women in this bar, and he goes, well, what about this? He's talking to his voices about the women. He goes, what about that one over there? And the voices said, no, go with that one over here. So he goes and he gets her, he takes her home, and she'd like to be strangled while they were having sex. Mm-hmm. But he went a little bit too far and she lost consciousness, and he thought he had murdered her. And the voices were telling him to do that all along. So yeah, these are conscious negative entities. They hit everybody. They hit us all. And, this is all in the spiritual realm. Psychology, psychiatry, social work, none of them deal with the spirit. None of them have ever, in my entire education or career, have ever talked about the spirit or spiritual aspects. It's all physical stuff, So when you were dealing with Mace, you were dealing at the energetic level, because thoughts are energy, memories energy, feelings are energy, all that's energy. They don't deal with that. They're stuck in the physical universe that isn't the problem.
Yeah, big time. You're fighting. It's like you've picked up a sword and you're trying to cut through smoke. It's just not the job. It's a different.
It's not doing it.
It's a totally different thing. I mean, these things. A little sidetrack. I remember you mentioned a few stories where these things. So I'm trying to wrap my head around, like, what are they? Are they? So you've mentioned a few stories where they've been like raping people and like trying to have sex with them and stuff.
Yeah.
And I remember you were talking about a story where a woman, these voices were telling her that we're having sex with you. Do you know the one I'm talking about?
Yep. Yeah.
Do you remember that? Because I have an interesting take on that.
That's not uncommon. I've had a number of women complain to me that these spirits were raping them at night, and they didn't want to tell anybody because they knew they wouldn't believe it.
Yeah.
I had one prisoner in the prison who came in. And he said they attacked me last night and they ripped open my back. And he goes, you want to see? And I said, well, no harm. Yeah, show me. Took off his shirt, and here's 4 claw marks, like 4 fingers, like this. Just went right down his back. You could see the 4 claw marks on his back. He said, I was in bed all night. I couldn't have done that to myself. And if anybody else did it to him, there would probably be a black eye or two that went along with it, because it would have fostered a fight. But the one you're talking about, I remember talking to her, and she goes, the voices came and they told me they were having sex with me. And she said, no, you're not. No, you're not. And they said, we have sex with you every time you masturbate.
Yeah, what's interesting about that, and I remember when you said that, and a little penny dropped again, I think these things have far more of, if you look throughout history, and even things as subtle as language, like if you look at the English language, how do you spell words? Like there's this weird undertone, but they kind of leave it, and in plain sight. If you look at the word masturbate, it's the master bait. It's a bait. Do you know what I mean? So these little clues get left. It's like I think you've used this analogy before. They're kind of like fishermen that throw thoughts out into whatever dome you have, and then whether you accept them or reject them. The word masturbate. That's very interesting. I wonder who came up with that word. Was it a jinn? Do you know what I mean? So I want to. There's a certain story that you've told, and this was hilarious because I was like a little girl. You know, like when I take it you're married, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just got married and moved in with my wife, and obviously when you first move in, you're like, right, I'm a big macho man. I'm gonna show off my, all that stuff. And I went to bed and I was like, okay, the great thing to do at 11:30 at night when you're like petrified is you put in your earphones and you listen to stories about demons attacking people. It's very wise. And there was a story that you told. And I remember listening to it, and I was like a little boy. I wasn't getting out of bed. I had the covers over me and everything. It was kind of like the penny drop moment where your denial system collapsed. It was with a certain that one. I remember when I first heard that. And I'm not just saying this because you're here and it's easy on the ear. And I wouldn't say I'm particularly unaware or naive, but that was one of those moments where I was like, okay. That's kind of like, if you take it with the sincerity it deserves, it's kind of a life-changing moment where you're like, okay, this world, even if you take the human eye, I think you can only see 3% of the visible light spectrum.
Yeah. Yeah. So I didn't want to believe this for years. I was thinking, oh well, this is some figment of their subconscious mind, or I make up all these excuses because I didn't want to believe what they actually were, But with each bit of information I found, it was like my denial system got weaker and ricketier, and it was just kind of held together by Scotch tape and string. It was very flimsy. So what I was doing, and this was at the prison, because when I started working with schizophrenics at the prison, I didn't have to worry about psychiatry jumping down my throat. They were overwhelmed in the first place. They weren't watching me. And if any of the prisoners went to the warden and or the psychiatrist and told them, hey, this guy's asking me questions about the voices that I don't like, they would have went, get out of my face, go pound sand somewhere. They wouldn't even give them the time of day like they did at the state hospital, where they got all upset about it. I mean, for the staff at the prison, that was the least of their concerns. Was an inmate being hurt over being asked questions about his voices? That didn't even register past the background noise. So I always had a group of maybe 10 or 12 schizophrenics around me. Now, these were special guys because not all of them would work with me. And these were people that had agreed. I had an agreement with them. I'll help you out as much as I can in any way I can, without getting in trouble. But I want you to tell me in real time what the voices are telling you as we're working together. So I was able to have conversations with these voices. I would the prisoner would say, well, the voices are saying this, and I'd respond back. I said, well, tell them that, go tell them to stick their head in the toilet or something like that. Well, they don't like you. They're saying you're a fool. You're a nincompoop. You don't know what you're talking about. And
they're hallucinations. They're meant to be hallucinations, by the way.
Yeah, it's always like that kind of stuff. So I was able to get a pulse of what they were. And I always had a group of these people around me while I was working there. So there was no lack of them in the prison, because they'd shut down the state hospitals and dumped all these people onto the street. This is the deep state and the demonic forces. They couldn't work. They had to steal or use drugs or sell drugs to survive. So they end up in prison at a cost of twice what it cost them to keep in the state hospital. And they're not getting any help in the prison.
Yeah.
They just drug the ones that are out of control, and the rest they let go crazy as long as they're not causing any trouble. So what happened was more patterns started to come out. Not only was the negativity, the anti-religious, but I found that they fostered and create negative emotion. They energetically drained their victims. They got louder after sunset. They got louder when ignored. So one of the things I heard at when I was at the state hospital, one patient was complaining to a psychiatrist that about his voices, and he was already on medication. So the psychiatrist said, "Oh, just ignore them. They're hallucinations." I remember calling him back a week later, and I asked, "Well, how'd that go for you?" You know, I was there when he told you that, when the psychiatrist told you to ignore the voices. I said, "How'd that go for you?" He said, "It didn't go well." He said they got louder. So I started asking other schizophrenic patients, what happens when you just ignore the voices? Just don't listen to them. Same exact thing. They will not be ignored. They refuse to be ignored. They get louder and more persistent. Okay? So here's all these patterns starting to show up. They get louder after sunset. Why would a hallucination get louder after sunset? Why would a hallucination get louder when ignored? You know, why would a hallucination foster self-destructive behavior? Why would a hallucination tell the patient to isolate themselves? You know, why? You know, none of this made any sense. Why would a hallucination gaslight the patient?
Yeah.
You know,
A hallucination for the people watching, because the majority of people who watch me are Christians and Muslims. Listen to what Jerry's just said, and then the hallucinations that hate humanity, hate religion, and seem to enjoy creating despair in man. I don't know if you've ever read that anywhere. I don't know if you've ever had a Bible or a Quran, but it sounds rather familiar, doesn't it? So an unseen entity that hates humanity, whenever you mention a positive, authoritative, godlike figure, they get angry. And these are hallucinations. I think people can kind of read between the lines of that. You know, I mean, it's like crazy.
yeah. So the more I investigated these things, the more patterns started coming up. Okay. And if they're running patterns, they're not hallucinations. Hallucinations don't run patterns. So what the Psychiatric Mafia had done, and Big Pharma, is they kicked it up into genetics. They kicked it up into biochemical stuff. All these patterns, everybody can see them for themselves. I mean, I'll read the rest of them. So you asked what these things are. They are these patterns. This is how they behave. So you ask what is a magnetic field? It's like these entities. I mean, they're energy. Magnetic field is energy. You know, if you try to detect a magnetic field with your senses, you're not going to see it. You can't see it. You can't feel it. You can't taste it. You can't touch it. You can't hear it. And for all practical purposes, it's not there. It's the same thing with these entities. You know, these are the operational aspects of them. You know, so they get louder after sunset. They get louder when ignored. They foster self-destructive behavior. They foster isolation. So this is like when you get a magnet and you get a jar full of iron filings. And you put that jar on the magnetic field. All of a sudden, the magnetic field appears. You can see it on the iron filings. Okay, these patterns are the iron filings for the entities, for the voices. You know, they foster isolation. They demand the attention of the victims. They constantly maneuver for increased control. They gaslight. They manipulate perception. They have complete access to the schizophrenic's memory. They can bring up all the rotten things that they've ever done. They demand that the victim not tell anybody about their presence. They're consummate liars. They lie about everything. You can't trust anything they say. They will not keep any bargain they make with you. They consistently steer the victim away from anything that might generate joy or peace or happiness. They can manipulate feeling without speaking. They short-circuit reason. They try to pass themselves off as thoughts belonging to the victim. So
I didn't mean to butt on it. When you say the short circuit reason, does that mean, like, okay, so say you're a gambling addict and you've got a full procedure and you have all you go, okay, gambling's bad for this, it's bad for that, it's bad for that, the reason I do it, blah blah blah. But then when you walk past a casino, it's like you're in this hypnotic state where you can't It's like there's oil poured over your head and nothing's sticky. You can't get any of it, and you're like, is that what you're meaning? It's like all the reason that you have, the logical reason to not engage with, for lack of a better word, a sin, when they come and they try and get you to engage with it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You know?
Exactly.
It's like an alcoholic who knows he can't drink, but its thoughts in his head are going, yeah, go to the bar, go meet your friends. Yeah, you know, you can go there and not drink. You know, not reasonable.
That's why I think things you can do when it comes to a form of addiction is that idea of, oh yeah, just one more time. This is the last time. I'll do it today. You know, I've not got anything going on, and then I'll quit. It's like, that's a lie. You know, these like,
yeah.
You notice these patterns, and when you start to, we'll get into the That's a Lie program, but I've started implementing that. I mean, I kind of try and tone it down because I don't want people to think I'm schizophrenic, where they're in the same room as me, and I'm just
no. It works with all negative thoughts. Now, Sherry Sweeney, my co-author for the book we wrote. Before I forget to show it, you know, Amazing Journey into the Psychotic Mind. Mm-hmm. She's the one that came up with the That's a Lie program. Okay, now this book talks about how we came to the conclusion that these voices are entities, that they're not hallucinations. You know, and Sherry heard voices when she was a young woman, and she's an engineer and kind of like a computer geek, and she figured that this was like programming. So what she did is block that program with the That's a Lie program, because she realized, like I realized, that the voices were consummate liars. So they have to get you to believe those lies and act on those lies to take control. But if you say that's a lie, then they can't get you. They can't get their hooks in you. Mm. So, you know, there's some people that have been totally cured by using That's a Lie program, including Sherry herself. Now, even though it doesn't cure most people, it helps them get better. The voices don't have as much influence on them.
It seems to me that their only defense is that they haven't been identified. It's kind of like as soon as you identify them, that's like their Achilles heel. Like I said, it's like the analogy that what you were saying, you're attacking something metaphysical with a physical remedy. It's like seeing smoke in the air and shooting bullets at it. It's not going to do anything.
Right.
And it's what was my point? One thing I don't know if this is just my eternal sort of optimism, but do you think they are inherently evil, or do you think it's more of like a, so you know, there's like a hierarchy of food, like we a cow, and the cow eats the grass, and the grass or the cow eats whatever, and then that eats whatever. Do you think it's like they're inherently evil, or do you think we are like a food source to them? Because say obviously I've never been a cow, and nor would I want to be, but you know, if you're a farmer, and I'm not one of these like vegan guys at all I eat is steak. But say, you know, you're a cow and you're on the farm, and your farmer comes along. He's like, hey, how you doing, pet? And you're a cow, and you're like, moo, you're great fun. And then eventually the farmer comes after he's tricked you and he's cut your head off, and you're like, that wasn't nice. Do you think they're inherently evil, or do you think it's kind of like without feeding off us, they would starve, and therefore they perhaps aren't evil? They're just kind of hardwired to need to feed. Do you know what I mean? Do you see where I'm coming from?
Well, see, they feed off of the low frequencies, so they're low frequency themselves. Okay, and there is a hierarchy to them. There's a fellow named Howard Pittman, who, you know, he's like a what do they call it?
A mystic.
Well, he's not a mystic. He died and came back. So he was given a tour of hell, and he talked about the echelons there. There's layers, you know,
Yep.
all the way from the, you know, the Nephilim type guys all the way down to the soldiers that are kind of like these voices. Right? Yeah. Now, what I've found in talking to the voices themselves is that they are miserable. They are slaves. Yeah. They have been told that they have no light in them, that light is bad, to stay away from it, and if they don't do what they're told that they would cease to exist.
Yeah,
that's what they believe.
That's that, and you can see the parallel with humanity in that. I mean, and people, I'm not going to bang on about it because I've brought it up to death, but people will know. And from with me, I'm still in bother with the UK government. I made a video saying children shouldn't be taught about sodomy in primary school, and I got arrested for that on a YouTube video.
Oh,
And
for crying out loud! What a bunch of morons!
It's crazy.
What a friggin' bunch of morons!
Crazy. So I said on a YouTube video that and I'm not saying you can't identify. I said a man can't be a woman, and that children shouldn't be taught about anal sex in school. And the police sent a warrant for my arrest, put me in a cell, detained my assets, and I've got a court case coming up. Now, if you were to take the school teacher, now, and again, I'm not interested. I think people should be able to do what they want. I'm just against the sort of grooming of children. Now, if you take a school teacher, if you take a school teacher and she comes into class and she, again, like we were saying, she's been told you're a dumb monkey and your ancestors were monkeys and you're just a chaotic explosion and you're gonna die one day and nothing matters, and she's in debt. You know, she's in a usury Federal Reserve system, so she has a mortgage, she can't own the house, she has to pay off the debt, and she's told you have to go and teach children how to sodomize each other. She isn't inherently bad. She's just like a foot soldier that has been kind of tricked, like a false sense of morality, and say that they could be looking at us and going, look at them. And that's actually, I don't want to go on a tirade, but that's sort of the biblical Abrahamic Quranic narrative, is that Satan didn't believe that he was too good and he wouldn't bow down to man, and his whole mission is to make man miserable, to embarrass them, like you were saying, to foster self-destructive behavior. And it's kind of like they could look at us and go, look, there's my point, look at what she's doing, she's teaching the kids and corrupting them about this, but they're not inherent. The teacher isn't a bad woman. It's like they're in a situation where they've been co-opted into kind of having to do it. And that's sort of the thought process I was having when I was listening to this. I think these foot soldiers are very, very much. I mean, if you look at just like a little old lady who works at the IRS, she doesn't understand about fractions.
I think a more apt comparison would be a soldier in the army.
Exactly.
They are supposed to kill the enemy.
Yeah.
You know, and a soldier that doesn't kill the enemy is going to be disfavored. Now, I did hear one account where the patient told me that the voice that was plaguing her wasn't bad enough, so it was replaced by another that was worse.
Mm-hmm. And
that's the only case I've heard. That's the only case I've heard like that.
That makes a lot of sense, because I've always had the opinion that I think anytime blood's, and again, I'm not trying to come across as like a hippy dippy guy, but anytime blood is spilled, like the only loser is man. It's like anytime Sons of Adam goes pink mist, the only loser is man. No one wins from that. And if you look at the wars that have happened, I'm not going to get conspiratorial, but every single war that's happened, including World War II, like Libya, all the Middle Eastern wars, all got to do with putting a central bank in a country. And these brave men that go off and they're told, you're fighting for freedom, you're fighting for freedom. But they're not bad people. If you look at it now with the retrospect we have, you're like, you could, you know, remember, you're older than me, when people came back from Vietnam and they were told, you're a baby killer, you're this and that. It's like they never seen it like that. They thought they were fighting for freedom. It's not like they're inherently bad. And that's sort of the impression that I get with these entities, is that the foot soldiers aren't inherently bad. It's like they've been coerced and tricked into thinking they have to. Do you know where I'm coming from?
Well, yeah, but one thing's interesting is they've been told that they didn't have any light in them.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what they've been told. But you can actually go with them and go down through the levels and say, watch for the light. It will look like a burning ember. It'll be a dim orange light. And when they see it, they are furious that they've been lied to. And I found that, you know, since they're bold-faced liars themselves, when they find out that their uppers have been lied to them about them having light, they were furious. And that boggled my mind. And it was consistent. You know,
And it's
what,
like an exact parallel with humanity as well. I mean, you speak to guys who, and again, I'm not interested in what's right. I'm interested in what's right, not who's right. You'll take guys who are sort of vets from the Afghanistan war, and when they kind of go, it wasn't really what we were told, they become furious. They're livid. They're like, I can't believe I was told to do that. And it's
right.
like an exact parallel with humanity, just on an unseen level, you know?
Yep, same kind of thing. But this Howard Pittman, Howard O. Pittman, he died, was given a tour of hell and the echelons in hell, and detailed descriptions. He was shown how these evil forces work. So you can go to www.howardpittman.org, and you can read these accounts that he wrote while he was clinically dead. So, and then he came back, and he was allowed to remember most of it. There's some areas he wasn't allowed to remember, but his story is fascinating. And he said that these demons have no love, not for themselves or not for anybody else. And he says it's the demons themselves that teach there is no such thing as demons. And that's even taught through the churches. He said they want people to believe that there is no such thing as demons because it gives them total unfettered, access to people. He says every sin committed by mankind, even down to the smallest, is a result of the influence of Satan and these demons in the lives of the people who commit these sins. And he finishes off by saying, you cannot fight an enemy you don't believe exists.
That's so true, man. It's so true. It's like, I think like that once you identify it's like anyone that's had some form of sin that's compulsive, like again, I'll go back to like alcoholism. I'd imagine that an alcoholic will sit there with a bottle of beer in his hand and he'll be like, consciously, he can even speak, I don't want to drink this. I don't want to drink it. But again, the reasoning gets short-circuited and then they drink it anyway. And it's like you don't know where your enemy is. It's kind of like you've gone into a sword fight with blindfolds on and you're just kind of swinging about and doing whatever. As soon as you identify you have an enemy. I mean, the Quran states that like Satan is an enemy to you. Take him as that. And people just kind of go, but they blow it off. And it's like, once you realize your addictions and vices, they're not you. It's an enemy that you have. It's an enemy that you just can't see. And let's just
you look at your thought stream, your regular thought stream that's running through your head all the time, blabbing, blah, 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 telling you this, telling you that, telling you all this stuff you already know, telling you other people are bad, this is stupid, that's, if you are that thought stream, if you're the one that is hearing all this stuff, then who's listening to it?
Yep, absolutely. There was a fantastic analogy that you made, which I have been spurting to people now, and it was saying, if you think your thoughts are your own, it's kind of like if you were to take a radio transmitter in the 30s and you were to go, find me the guy that's speaking through the radio, and you cut it open, you're never going to find the guy there. It's like your brain. It's like your brain's like a transmitter connected to something, and depending, I guess,
it's a receiver.
It's a receiver. It's like depending on, this is speculation, but depending on the level of sin that you live with, it's like you're attached to a frequency. You know what I mean? And I've said this for a while. Exactly. When you cut open the human brain, and then people can go Google this. When you cut open the human brain, there's no part of the brain for the mind. There's no part of the brain for imagination. They don't exist. Like the mind is, there's no part of the brain for it. And it's like, okay.
And nobody's ever found a thought in the brain.
Yeah, exactly. You can't find it. It's like, and that's where I get it's it's like what I was saying about alcohol. You consent. Okay, I know I'm completely going off here, but you know how if you take the Abrahamic, and I'm not saying it, it's what I'm more inclined to believe, but they talk about how Satan's below you, which means he requires your consent to do things. And even if you look at every war or every atrocity in the world, no one. Okay, so if you look at the the issues that happened in the past 2 years. No one came to you and put a gun to your head and told you, put a gag on your face. They had to sell it to you and make you do it to yourself. And it's like, if you take the alcohol idea, once you give consent by committing a sin and drinking the alcohol, then you've consented to dropping to their frequency, and now
Right.
the input and output is from them. Do you know what do you kind of get what
That's exactly right. So Swedenborg basically says you got two demons and you got two angels assigned to you. Okay, those demons are always putting thoughts into your thought stream, telling you to do this or think this, or it's all negative stuff. But you're the one who decides if you want to listen to them or not. Nobody's forcing you to listen to them or follow through on what they say. And the Native Americans say you've got two wolves on your each shoulder. One is a good one and one is a bad one. The one that gets strongest is the one that you're going to feed the most. So what I've seen is that the voices speak in the language of the person that they're inflicting. But for the most part, the positive spirits don't speak to the person unless they're on the verge of death. Then they might warn them or something like that. But for the most part, they communicate in feelings and intuition. It's not like words. It's like you don't feel good about doing this thing to somebody else, or you don't feel good about abusing somebody else. I mean, it's more feelings than it is thoughts. And there's a constant battle going on in your head for that, for your attention, and for you to make choices. Nobody forces you to make a choice to do something bad, or to choose to do something bad against yourself, or to use drugs or to use alcohol. So, addicts and alcoholics, when they choose to use those drugs and they become addicted, it's not just them drinking or drugging. It's this whole host of spirits that can't get high in the spiritual form because they're spiritual. They have to move into a physical body to get that high. So they're the ones that keep the person drinking and drugging, even though that person knows they shouldn't be doing that. They demand it. So, all they got to do is get you to take one drink and you're gone. So there's like 23 of these patterns that these voices run. And again, these are consistent patterns. Everybody can see them for themselves. You can go to my website at jerrymarzinsky.com under the articles section, pull them up for yourself, and see these things for yourself. They're right in plain view. Anybody who works with schizophrenics, anybody who has a schizophrenic family member, you can see these patterns for yourself. This is what the voices are. This is what they operate on. This is how they push things. Okay, it's not hidden. It's not some biochemical imbalance or genetic thing that you can't examine. You can see these things for yourself. And if the voices are running patterns that you can see for yourself right in front of your own face, if you look at this list, then they can't be hallucinations like the Psychiatric Mafia and Big Pharma insist they are. Right? So if they're not hallucinations, then there's something else.
That's interesting. 23 patterns they run, 23 times Jesus cast them out in the Bible, and the 23rd Psalm. There you go. Interesting.
Yeah, I never thought of that.
3, 6. There you go. Anyway.
But see what happened as I was uncovering these patterns with the group I had in the prison. Okay. I would take these and I would think about, okay, what can I throw into these patterns that will screw up the voices? How can I throw a monkey wrench in there that that'll mess up these patterns? Okay. And I would come up with these things for these prisoners to do, and then they'd come back the next week, and I'd ask them, well, how did that go? And I'd get feedback from all these prisoners about the different things that we were trying to screw these voices up. And at some point, they started all coming back and going, the voices don't like you. They don't want me coming here. They think you're foolish. They act up every time I come here. They go crazy. They don't want me to come. They tell me not to go, not to show up, to skip my appointments. They don't like you, And that was one after another, after another, after another. And this went on for a long time. And I kept, doing things that would screw up their pattern. And then one day, one of the prisoners turned in the doorway, and as he was leaving, and he looks at me and he goes, "You realize what you're doing is dangerous, don't you?" And I just looked at him. I didn't even think about it. It hadn't ever crossed my mind. I'm going, well, these things are stuck in your head, not mine. I'm not dealing with them. You are. So I kind of put that in the back of my mind, and I didn't forget about it. I just kind of like, well, this is something to keep your eye on. And then I was reading a book. I was still aware that these voices were draining these patients. They were, the schizophrenic voices were stealing their energy. So, but they had to get them upset to do that first. Right? And I didn't have any verification of that other than what these prisoners were telling me. And then I read this book called The Voice of Knowledge by Miguel Ruiz. He's a South American shaman.
Yeah, he wrote Four Agreements.
Yes, he wrote the Four Agreements. And he was talking about these same entities that were draining people. I mean, here it was, and I hit that chapter and I went, holy cow, he's seeing the same thing that I'm seeing. Okay, so I brought that book into the prison and I started asking this one prisoner who was particularly good about giving me feedback. I said, I brought this book in. I want your opinion on what this guy says. I'm going to read it to you. And let me see, I had a warning first. No, what happened before that was one of the guys I was working with knocked on my door in the psychology department. He didn't have a pass, which is unusual. And he knocks on the door, and I open the door, and he goes, the voices want to talk to you. And that took me aback, because in the decades before, when I was working, they never spoke to me directly. They always spoke through the patient. The patient would say, well, the voices are now saying you're full of crap, or the voices are telling me to leave your office, or the voices are telling me this or that. And I would tell him, like an intermediary, well, tell him to go jump in a lake, or whatever, or ask him questions or stuff like. They didn't like to be asked questions. So it was always with the patient as the intermediate. This was straight up, where this guy was saying the voices want to talk to you. And I said, they want to talk directly to me. He said, yeah, they want to talk directly to you. So I said, okay, come on in. We sat down, closed the door, and I said, what do they have to say? And his voice changed slightly, got a little bit deeper, and this is the words that came out of his mouth. You have no right to interfere with our way of life. My head just, boom, it just exploded. My denial system completely collapsed. It was already in tatters.
That's exactly what
it just collapsed. I went into shock. I canceled all my appointments for the rest of the day, and I just sat there looking out the window going, where is this going? What am I getting into? I don't have a cognitive map for this. I can't talk to anybody about this. I was starting to feel like I was going crazy.
Yeah.
It's like, and there was nobody to talk to. I couldn't talk to anybody. I tried to tell my wife. She go, what are you picking on the heads of these psychotic killers for anyway? Why are you doing that crazy stuff? Don't do that anymore. And it's like, that wasn't any help. It was like, so after I recovered from that, I mean, it took me a little bit, and I didn't stop picking into the heads of these guys and looking for these patterns and looking for ways to screw up the patterns. So the next thing that happened was I brought the Miguel Ruiz book in when I read the part where he was talking about them being energy vampires. And I brought this one guy in who was like my chief snitch on the voices. He would tell me everything they were doing. And I said, I want to read this to you and tell me what you think of it. this guy, so I started reading, and then at some point, this guy, he's just stark still. And I look up and he's just staring at me with this blank stare, this weird blank stare. And all of a sudden behind my back erupted this electrical crackling, it sounded just like an arc welder. It was loud. Crack, 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 right behind me. And I'm like, what's going on? I'm looking at him and I look around and this crackling moves from behind me up the right wall, and it starts going at a 45-degree angle up my office wall, crackling the whole time. Crack, 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 crack. I didn't see anything. I didn't smell anything, but it was loud and it was moving. And I was afraid to take my eyes off him because I thought he was going to attack. So I pushed my chair back against the wall. So if he does come at me, I can kick him back and have half a chance. And all they put in the medical unit were female officers. They wouldn't have been of any use at all, or not much.
Don't say that, or you're going to put in jail in the UK.
Yeah. So I'm switching my attention back and forth between, watching this guy just sitting there staring at me like a zombie and trying to see what was crackling. I couldn't see anything. And then it starts moving across the ceiling over his head, and I'm able to watch it and him at the same time. Still couldn't see anything, couldn't smell anything. There wasn't anything burning. There was no light. It was just this loud electrical crackling. And then it starts coming down the wall, the left-hand wall, kind of where I'm sitting, and it jumps into this Rubbermaid trash can right next to my leg, and it's crackling in that trash can. And I bend over and I look, and there's nothing in that trash can, just this crackling. And then boom, it just goes damn dead, just like that, And I look at this guy, and he's just staring at me. I said, "Did you hear that?" And he just stares. He didn't answer. And he didn't say anything. And I'm thinking, okay, what's he going to do now? And he slowly gets up and he goes, "I gotta leave." And he shuffles out of the office. And I'm like, go, get out of here. I don't want to see you again. So he goes down the hall, and I examine the walls. I'm looking for burn marks, if something's crackling like that, maybe something's burned. There were no burn marks. There was nothing, no evidence that this had ever happened. And there's nobody I could talk to about it, And so I go out in the hall, and I look at all the other offices in the hall. The doctors aren't in yet. The nurses aren't in yet. All their offices are closed up. There is no explanation for that whatsoever. But it lasted for a good while. It was like 20 seconds or more, or maybe 30 seconds. It went on. It wasn't just like a short blip where you go, well, okay, that was just some anomaly that happened that you could blow it off. There was no blowing it off. It lasted way too long. So I think it was 3 or 4 months before I got the courage to call this guy back again. And finally I did. I put out a pass for him. He came. He looked good. I thought he would be a wreck. I thought he'd be an absolute wreck. No, he looked good. I told him, I thought you'd be a wreck. I mean, you look good. He said, yeah, I've been doing what you said. I haven't got rid of the voices, but I'm able to beat them back. I'm able to hold my ground. They're still there, but they're not taking me over anymore. And I said, come on and sit down. I said, you remember the last time you were in the office? I said, did you hear that crackling sound? And he goes, yeah, I heard it, but I was surprised that you heard it. He's surprised that I heard it. And I said, what was that? He said, that was them. And I said, them who? The voices? He said, yeah, that was the voices. And that shook me up, because I didn't think they could affect physical reality. I thought they were just kind of spiritual, like smoke or something like that. They could put thoughts in people's head, but I didn't think they could directly.
I shot, for lack of a better term, I was listening to that about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I shot myself when I heard that girl going, oh dear, someone's going to come crawling up my leg. This is horrible.
It spooked me out of my mind. I closed off the office. I didn't see anybody for the rest of the day, and I was in shock.
I remember he said something to you, though. He said something as to why he didn't. There was what the voices were telling him to do.
Oh, yeah. I asked him. I said, you looked weird. when you left the office. I said, what were the voices telling you when you were walking out of the office? He said, they were telling me to go to get a shank and stick it in your gut. And the shank is a homemade prison knife, manufactured prison knife. And I was thinking, oh, he wouldn't do that. I've been working with him for 6 months. He's one of my prime candidates, I didn't see him as a bad or evil guy. And I said, well, why didn't you do it? And he said, because I couldn't find one and nobody would give me one. That was spooky. That was really spooky.
Yeah.
So my denial system was shot. There was no pretending that these things weren't negative entities after that. They were. The thing is, I still didn't have a good cognitive map of how they operated. And I imagine it like going, Wilson Van Dusen, the clinical psychologist that I was working with for a year, he's the one that kind of cracked the door open by writing. Now, he still called them hallucinations, but he didn't describe how they behaved as hallucinations. Okay? So he still wasn't willing to break with the traditional psychiatric mafia's concept that they were hallucinations. Even though he described them as other than hallucinations, he still called them hallucinations. He cracked the door open, and I kind of pushed it open and went in. And then I'm going like, okay, I don't have a roadmap to this. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what I'm facing. I don't know where the pitfalls are. I don't know where I am. I don't know how things operate here. I don't know the rules. And it was scary. It was terrifying. And it kind of overwhelmed my adrenaline junkie stuff and went from adrenaline junkie to fear.
Yeah.
I was afraid. I didn't know what I was getting into. Yeah. So slowly, step by step, I kind of figured out what the rules were, how they operated. So, Big Pharma and the Psychiatric Mafia have deluded the entire planet as to what these things are. They are not hallucinations. And you look at how the Psychiatric Mafia is doing. We got more psychiatrists and more psychiatric drugs on this planet now than we've ever had in the history of mankind. And look at the mess we're in. Look at the number of mentally ill people just astronomically increasing. These drugs aren't doing any good. Now, you look at psychiatry itself, you might say that the suicide rate of the subpopulation might have something to say about their stability. Okay, so you go to a tribe in Africa, if their suicide rate is 25%, something's wrong.
Yeah.
So the National Mental Health Institute, Miami National Institute of Mental Health, estimated that 4.9% of people with schizophrenia will kill themselves. Their suicide rate is 5 to 10 times higher than that of the general population. Okay, we know they're not stable. Now, when you take a look at these high priests of psychiatry who run our mental health system around the globe right now, okay, you look at their suicide rate. According to the Journal of the American Medical Association, the suicide rate for psychiatrists is 65 out of 100,000, or 5.9 times that of the general population. So they're killing themselves at 5.9 times that of the average person. These are the people that run our mental health center on the planet right now, for crying out loud. The Journal of Clinical Psychiatry in 1980 did a 5-year study of 18,730 consecutive physician deaths by suicide and found psychiatrists suicided regularly year by year at rates more than twice those expected, and these differences were statistically significant. So, and they're being assaulted at a much higher rate than any other doctors too. These are the people that run our mental health system. Not only in our country, but in your country too.
It's kind of eerie, isn't it? I always said this. I've always been trying to wrap my head around things. If you look at suicide now and how prevalent it is, and just not even I think there was a quote, it's like most people live quiet lives of subtle desperation or something like that. If you take there's a whole big point, and I want to get your opinion on it, but I'll get into that later. But if you look at things like war 300 years ago, which you could look at as a catastrophe, it was typically a people who wanted to defend their way of life. And I've always thought this is like there was valor involved. There was piety involved. There was courage.
I want you to believe that.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, that's a good point. But my thinking process, and I'm totally willing to being wrong, but it's like even if you were in a war at that time, there would still be like a moment of bravery. Like you'd see your friend just rise up like a phoenix, and there'd be something that would be inspirational to a degree. And now you just see today, it's like this rotting from the inside out. It's like men. I mean, I'll extrapolate. You look at World War I, which I think is probably one of the worst things that ever happened in human history. Men would like fight to survive. They'd have shrapnel in their legs. They wouldn't have eaten for a week. They'd probably have some form of infected related illness, but they would fight to live. They'd want to be home with their kids and all this stuff. And now it's like people are actively trying to just escape. They just get like they want to die. And I sit there and I go, that doesn't make much coherent sense. It's like these things are having a field day.
Oh, they are having a field day. So let's take a quick look at how the Psychiatric Mafia is doing. With more psychiatrists, more psychologists, and more psychiatric drugs on the planet than the entire history of mankind now, the CDC here in the U.S. reports that 132 people in the U.S. are killing themselves every day. 132 every day. Suicide is the 11th leading cause of death in the United States. In 2021, 48,000 Americans killed themselves, and the rate was increasing every year. Last year, it was almost 50,000 in the United States. 50,000 people are killing themselves in the United States every friggin' year. 50,000 soldiers died in the Vietnam War over 10 years. And
that was more the point I was trying to make, sorry.
And 50,000 people are killing themselves here in the United States every year with psychiatry at the helm. The Psychiatric Mafia.
Only the people
big
killing
pharma.
Like it's kind of like when you look at divorce statistics, it's like 60% of people get divorced in America. That's the people who go over the line. You've probably still got 90% who are engaging in infidelity, etc. If you take 50,000 a year killing themselves, I wouldn't be surprised if it was close to 5 million or something like that who are thinking about it or living in a state of complete psychological misery. That's only the people that have the courage to go over the line and do it. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's crazy.
So these drugs and the Psychiatric Mafia are not helping anything. Matter of fact, according to the Center for Disease Control, the U.S. suicide rates have reached the highest level since World War II. They're increasing. Also, so are assaults and murders increasing with mental illness, and prison populations are just exploding. Does this look like an effective mental health system? This is a joke.
I mean, almost inspired by the entities themselves is what it seems like.
Yeah. You look at the duplicity of it all. I mean, this diagnostic and statistical manual, this book of mental illnesses that they've come up with, they treat it as the Bible. They treat it as the Bible in the PhD program. You had to memorize all these mental illnesses, these so-called mental illnesses. In psychology, that there was the DSM, and when you're working on the front lines, it's the dictionary. Had to give everybody a diagnosis. This thing was completely made up. It was it was made up of 2/3 of the people who were involved are psychiatrists. They meet once every few years. They make up these mental illnesses. It's a complete work of fiction. Every single one of the 296 psychiatric disorders in the DSM-5 have completely been made up by a group of psychiatrists. They vote these in and they vote them out.
And they seem very fluid, don't they? Like they'll rotate, and 550 will come in one year, and then 5 years later, 100 of them are gone, and then 5 years later, another bunch.
They'll vote them out. In 1952, the DSM listed 106 psychiatric disorders. In 1980, there were 256. And the DSM-5 now lists 297. There's more coming in. They're making up more all the time. And 2/3 of the psychiatrists on the board responsible for making up these psychiatric disorders have been reported to have ties to the pharmaceutical industry. Not one of the 297 mental disorders has a defining laboratory test or any kind of diagnostic test. Not one. There are no blood tests. There's no lab tests. There's no x-rays. They're just classes of behavior that these psychiatrists have taken and pathologized. They're basically a list of symptoms that psychologists have decided to make into clusters and label them mental illnesses.
Yeah, it's like the illness is fake and the medicine is poison. It's kind of like these entities have gotten into people's heads and they're creating an illusionary problem, which will then, how can I word it? It's like they're creating they're making a problem so you come to them for the solution, which is also a problem. It's like you were talking about how when people take methamphetamines, it's almost like and that's treated for kids. So kids are prescribed methamphetamine as a healing mechanism to a problem which doesn't exist. And those methamphetamines, when the kids take them, these entities just come and swoop right in. It's like what it reminds me of? It's like in London in the early 20th century, I believe, there was a gang going about, and they would smash windows with rocks, and then 5 or a couple hours later, the other bunch of them would drive by in a window repair van, and that's how they made their business. They'd create a problem which wasn't real, and then they brought the solution which benefited them. It's like, so this whole DSM-5 thing is just complete bogus, and then the medicine they feed you pretty much leads you on a path straight down to being encompassed by these entities. Yeah, like it's just very interesting. I mean, I remember you were talking about how these things, they come out at night most prevalently, and especially on a full moon. And that got my little brain thinking. It's almost like the sun for us is our light, and the moon for them is sort of theirs. I don't know if these things sleep or if they're outside of time. I don't quite know.
I don't think they sleep. There is no time. There is no space. Yeah. There is no matter for them. They operate in the energetic universe.
Yeah,
they don't play by the same rules we do. They can follow their victim anywhere. They can go underwater. They can go to another country. They can find them anywhere because they're energetic. They don't play by the rules of physical reality. So, yeah.
But you would say they're more prevalent at night. Like they seem to be stronger.
I'll tell you, with the full moon. I worked for over 10 years in the emergency rooms in hospitals doing psych crisis. My last 10 years I worked for anybody. And on a full moon, they would just pour into the ER. I mean, everybody knew it. Everybody braced for it. Nobody was allowed to talk about it because we felt we were superstitious. We felt if we mentioned it, then it would happen. Yeah. So nobody ever said it, but when they started pouring in on the full moon, we go, okay, here it comes. It's like it was noticeable. Everybody who worked in the ER knew it. Doctors, nurses, everybody. So yeah, the duplicity behind the psychiatric mafia and big pharma is incredible. I mean, this meeting that they made, they make up these mental illnesses in. One person described it as a tobacco barn. You know, like in the South, they had these tobacco barns where they would have bids on tobacco. So, you know, somebody would come in and go, "Hey, I've got a new mental illness, and these are its characteristics." And these 2/3 of the guys from Big Pharma would kind of go, well, can we make some kind of medicine to treat that, or something that would look like it, you know? And if they can, they go, oh, okay, well, we'll make it a mental illness, and then they give it this fancy description with all these big psychobabble words and these numbers to categorize it. You open up that DSM and it looks impressive. It looks like they know what they're talking about. But I'll tell you what, you put 10 of them in a room together and you give them a semi-complex diagnosis, don't let them talk to one another, and you watch, they'll come up with all kinds of crap. You'll be surprised if they all come up with the same diagnosis.
Yeah.
And you know, it says, so the new diagnostic Bible for psychiatry, the DSM, labels almost all human emotion as mental illness. A child who talks back, a man who spends too much time on the internet, a woman who grieves the death of her husband, or a child for more than 2 weeks are all labeled as mentally ill and told they need to be drugged. Unhappiness is labeled as depression, and people are encouraged to numb themselves with drugs instead of dealing with the life situations that are causing their unhappiness. Over 2/3 of psychiatrists who wrote the DSM-5 have financial ties to the drug industry. You know, virtually anybody who goes into a psychiatrist's office for anything will come out with a diagnosis and a prescription for some kind of drug. You know, now here's an example of some of the crazy diagnoses they've come up with. Mathematics disorder. If you don't like math, you're disordered. You have a disorder. Caffeine intoxication disorder. If you drink too much coffee, you got an intoxication disorder. Sibling rivalry disorder. These are kids fighting with one another. Sexual orientation disturbance, homosexuality. Now, some of the more bizarre ones. Florence syndrome, being overwhelmed by beauty, such as in Florence, Italy. The symptoms are fainting and dizziness. The treatment are antidepressant drugs. Paris syndrome, mostly experienced by Japanese people visiting France. Symptoms include depression, anxiety, feelings of persecution. You know, which, you know, what normally before the DSM came about, they would call that cultural shock.
Yeah.
Not anymore. They turned it into a diagnosis.
It's weird. It's like creating a problem out of nothing to then sell you a drug, which typically either destroys your brain from the inside out, or if it's a form of methamphetamine, allows these things into your head. I mean, I have some wacky ones. Like, I was thinking, this was maybe 2 weeks ago, and I'm a complete hypocrite because I've had about 3 cups of coffee today. But if you look at, I think caffeine is the second, and this is the reason I brought up the moon thing and how they're more prevalent at night. And I remember you were talking about how they just hammer and hammer and hammer their victim away at night. And people will know this. Like, you try to go to bed at night and your thoughts are just boof. And it's that sort of fatigue makes cowards out of all of us. It's like, if you can just beat someone and beat them and wear them and tire them, eventually you'll give in to submission. I think this happened in Soviet Russia. I think it was where they would want a man in jail and they would keep him up for 4 days straight. And he was so worn down and fatigued that when they brought him into court, he would testify against himself just so it would end. And if you look at caffeine, caffeine's the second and I brought this up because it's kind of like the DSM thing. It's the second largest traded commodity in the world, right? And I'm not Yoda. I'm not 700 years old. I know I understand I talk about the past a lot, but this probably is the most unproductive, fatigued, tired, just lazy generation of human beings. I don't know, since Sodom and Gomorrah, perhaps. And caffeine's the second most traded commodity in the world. And you look at that, and I'm like, that's not giving you energy, but it's keeping you up at night. Your circadian rhythm's thrown out the window, and now you're up when the full moon's out. And if you even, I know I have this weird thinking process, but if you look at the energy drinks you drink, you have Monster Energy. Well, that's very convenient, aptly named, and the symbol's the Hebrew 666. The Red Bull is another pretty one that's thrown straight in your face, just stuff like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
You know what I mean? So these, like, I know it seems like I'm a paranoid schizophrenic myself saying that, but it's like it's infected everything, where it's just like taking you away from how you're naturally meant to live, creating a false problem, and then selling you the solution, which typically feeds you towards them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, if you use too much of it. But one thing the voices, the schizophrenic voices do is the same things that you were talking about with the Russians. They do not let the patient sleep. They rag them all night, call them all kinds of names, fill their minds with anxiety. And if they can keep them from sleeping, then just like you said, they're more susceptible to the suggestions of these demonic entities to go out and do something that will get them in trouble or harm somebody else. So that's part of their deal. Schizophrenics have a hard time sleeping. That's why they give them all these drugs to friggin' knock them out of their senses. And why are they doing this? I mean, if what they're doing doesn't work, if their high priests are some of the most suicidal workers on the planet, why they're doing this is the money. Look at the antidepressant market in the U.S. is expected to reach $15.98 billion by 2023. We're talking billion. This isn't million. This is $1 billion. Now, depression can be treated by the MACE system, like you experienced, very effectively.
Fast as well. The speed is almost instantaneous.
Yeah, it's unbelievable what MACE will do. Matter of fact, for those of you out there who are having psychiatric problems and you're thinking about going to poison yourself with the Psychiatric Mafia and get some of these toxic drugs, check out MACE first. Go to www.maceenergymethod.com/about/. Read about it, and there will be a listing of MACE practitioners on that site. And it's a lot cheaper than going to a psychiatrist and paying for these drugs that don't do anything. Now,
it's an internal problem, and these drugs it's like we were saying, you have an internal problem and you're trying to fix it with an external solution. It doesn't work. Right. And I just want to say quickly, I'm not an affiliate. This doesn't financially benefit me, but I've done it, and I'm actually setting up with the practitioner I've been working with, sort of like just a once a week session, just to keep on top of everything, because it works so fast. It's interesting because I remember when I did it with her about a particular thing, a memory popped up which I had totally forgotten about, that I hadn't thought about for 15 years, just popped back up. I'd never recalled it, and pretty much all the time I'm aware of being conscious, and it just bang. So okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, and then after you're done, it's like, okay, you still remember the trauma, but it's like it doesn't affect you anymore. There's no charge to it.
It's exactly the best way to describe it.
Yeah. So, try that before you start using these toxic drugs with all these nasty side effects. They're horrible side effects. The global antipsychotic drug sales. Now, these are sales for these toxic antipsychotic drugs that actually shrink the patient's brain. They're actually doing physiological, neurological damage to the patient with long-term use. They're getting $14.54 billion in 2021 for those, and expected to reach $15.5 billion by 2022. Billion with a B, not million, billion. And look at some of these side effects. Nausea, weight gain, trouble sleeping, dry mouth, blurred vision. Now, this is for antidepressants. Anxiety, headaches, diarrhea, constipation, sexual problems, fatigue, tremors, increased swelling, lower alcohol tolerance, bleeding, low sodium levels, vomiting, restlessness, muscle cramps, and seizures. And it's even worse for the antipsychotic drugs. So you can see why the voices show up for schizophrenics and say, listen, you're being poisoned. You're feeling all this stuff when you take these drugs. You're being poisoned. Feel it for yourself. That's why they don't want to take them, and that's why they don't like psychiatrists.
It's
what's
interesting.
going on is what's going on the planet with psychiatry and big pharma right now is total insanity. It's just now these patterns that I read to you, and I didn't read all of them. Now, they're on the website at jerrymarzinsky.com. If you look at them, and then you look at what's coming out of the mainstream media right now, there's a one-to-one correspondence. They're identical.
Exactly.
What's coming out of the mainstream media is a macroscopic level of these psychotic voices. And the people that got a hold of you that you're having to go to court for, they're infected with them too.
The craziest part about that situation is I remember I was being interviewed by the police officer. And after the interview, the police officer said to me, I swear to God, so strike me down if I'm lying. The police officer who arrested and charged me after the interview said, "I agree with you, I just can't say it." And I go, so who are we benefiting here? It's just crazy. And I would actually go one step further and say, not just the mainstream media, it's almost every single thing that is fed to you now, whether education, entertainment,
yes.
mainstream media, every single thing it's exactly the same. It's just it's evoking despair. And that can't benefit anybody, because this was the point I was going to, when my court case comes, and I've been pondering this. I'm like, if you're a judge, it doesn't benefit you to now enter a world where you can be prosecuted for not liking kids being predated on. That doesn't benefit you. It certainly won't benefit your offspring. It won't benefit the world they inherit. Who is it benefiting? And I remember you were talking about how they hate kids, these entities like.
Oh, they hate kids. They absolutely hate kids.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I was working the ER and a psychotic mother came in, I would notify DPS right away, because they destroy kids. They absolutely destroy kids. Some of the most vicious battles I've seen is between the mother and the voices, with the voices telling the mother to harm the kid, and the mother fighting back. Unfortunately, the mother doesn't always win.
It's crazy. It's crazy. I remember you were talking about how there was a period, and forgive me if I'm wrong in saying it was a couple times, but there was a period where these things were coming after you, where they were like actively, and you could tell they were there, and how angry they were, how strong they were.
Yeah, that started in the prison, where I couldn't see them, I couldn't hear them, but I could feel them. And it was like this icky electrical energy, and I could tell when they were mad, and when they didn't like me around. I mean, I could feel it. It was just icky. It wasn't like any other feeling that I've ever had. It's like this icky electrical chill, and I could feel how angry they were. I could feel how upset they were. And there were times they were so upset, it felt like I had some kind of protective shield, like Star Trek, with their protective field, and that this thing was about to crush it. It felt like that protective field was just like, a billionth of an inch above my skin. And this thing was trying to break through. I always wondered what would happen if it did give way.
Yeah.
It never did, but it came close a number of times.
What was the worst it ever got, would you say? Or like, was there ever a time you were like, shit, they're gonna get me?
Well, that time where the guy told me that he would have stabbed me if somebody would have given him a shank. That was like hair raising. The other time they got me was I was about to go on one of the biggest podcasts in the U.S. And what I was doing was speaking anonymously, because they'd go after me. If I dropped my license because I knew they would take it. But if I was going to speak out, I couldn't maintain that license, because they would go after it. They'd make up some bull crap. They'd charge me with it and say, well, we kicked him out of we took his license because of this or that. So I just let it lapse, so they couldn't touch me. And but before that, I was speaking anonymously. I had a fake name, and I was 2 weeks away from going on this program, and I was down in Mexico, and I went to bed completely normally one night, and then woke up in the morning and I couldn't move my arm. My shoulder was killing me. It just was like that fast. And then it kept getting worse. The next day it was much worse. So I told the people I was with, I said, I got to get back. This is getting worse by the minute. And I got back to the U.S., went to the emergency room, and they admitted me immediately and operated the next morning. What had happened was a staph infection exploded in my right shoulder. I didn't even know that was possible. I thought if you got a staph and it was in your throat. I didn't even know it was possible for a staph infection to explode in your shoulder. They operated it. I don't know what they did, but boy, it felt like I'd been shot in the shoulder with a shotgun. It was 6 months of IV antibiotics. And I had to cancel that speaking engagement. But thank heavens the guy waited for me. And 6 months later, I went back on. I didn't have the energy to go onto a program and speak at that point. They completely wiped me out. That came out of absolutely nowhere.
I mean, it's interesting because there's been, I think, maybe 3 or 4 podcasts I've listened to you, and it's when you go to talk about they have no right to you have no right to interfere with our way of life, that the signal goes, the connection starts, the audio starts messing up. That's something I've noticed. I want to hear your take on this, right? Because you were talking about the electrical crackling come up the wall, right? And then how when you can tell they're present, there's an icky electrical feeling. And I
didn't feel it that. That was in the emergency room and in the prison.
Yeah.
That came later on. Toward the end of my years in the prison, I don't know exactly when it came on. It came on slowly. And in the emergency room, they couldn't lie to me, because I'd pull in a patient, well, what are you doing here? You're hearing voices. They'd say no. And I said, no, you're not telling me the truth. You're hearing voices, and this is how strong they are. I mean, it was so reliable that I could tell them that they were hearing voices. And they go, how you know? Do you hear voices too?
You could tell. Interesting, because I mean, I was pondering this as well. I think I don't know if it was Nikola Tesla's biography or it was an article or it was a video, because it was a while ago, but I remember it. That when Nikola Tesla, I think he described that the way he thought wasn't like how normal people think. It was obvious when you look at what he achieved. But it was like he would have visions that he could see directly in front of him. And I read somewhere that when he looked into Faustian deals, which is, if anyone doesn't know what that is, it's sort of like a satanic bargain where you know when people would mention they sell themselves out. And I actually think if you look at what, like you were saying about mainstream media, I personally think there's deals that have been struck between people in very high authority in this unseen realm. But I think that's gone on. But he was talking about how so a Faustian deal is like you sell your soul to the devil and you get a Lamborghini, but your legs are too short to reach the pedals. You get every woman on the planet you could want, but you have erectile dysfunction. It's like you never really quite get it. And he was looking into the Faustian bargains, and then after that, he got the inspiration for modern day electricity. And I've kind of noticed a pattern of, it's almost, and again, I could be totally wrong, but if you look at when electricity became prevalent, what's the first thing that happened? First World War, one of the worst travesties in human history. Second World War, exactly the same thing. Then you look at like now the level of just despair people live in, where it's like even from the second you're born, the woman gives birth on her back. You're not meant to do that. You cut the umbilical cord instantly. You're not meant to do that. Then you'd ram them full of the heavy metal, the baby full of heavy metal poisons, and then clip a bit of their dick off. It's like just crazy. And it's almost like these, I just want to hear your opinion on it. It's like, I could be totally off, but it's almost like the way they affect, when you were saying you didn't think they could affect reality, I've kind of noticed like a little pattern is, and again, I could be wrong, that the way they affect reality is like through electricity, like physical reality. Do you know where I'm coming from? Like, it's just a wacky speculation, but it's just a pattern I've noticed. I wanted to really ask you, because we'll probably do like another 20 minutes, wrap it up at 3 hours. What was the worst case of a patient that you ever interacted with? Like the one where the victim was just beyond help, just gone completely.
Well, it's so gross. I probably shouldn't talk about it.
Oh, really?
It was bad.
I don't think
you want me to tell you about it?
Yeah, go for it. Go for it. I don't. You can't leave me on a cliffhanger like that.
Now, I didn't actually witness this, but this fellow worked in the same building that I did. He worked on one of the floors upstairs, which was one of the more regressed units. So what he said is he was an attendant, okay, and he kind of watched over, dished out medicines, that kind of stuff. And here was this one patient, completely skinny as a rail, butt naked, standing up in the window of the building, looking out. And so Ron tried to get him to come down. He came down, and what he did is he put his hand behind him where his butt was, and he crapped out diarrhea in his hand, and then he took it and he put it in his mouth and swallowed it, and then he said, "Good boy, good boy." Those were the voices talking.
So crazy. So crazy. I mean, that's just I remember there was a story you were talking about as well with a guy that the voices had convinced him that he was somebody else, and he would get aggressive at his family who addressed him by his normal name. And then you'll read, again, I think a pattern I've noticed is it's not one specific, because one thing I think pushes people away from a more, I guess you could say, God-fearing way of life is that dogmatic, like, we're the real true people, and then the other ones are like, oh, you're not the real true one, I'm the real true God's favorite boy. But it's more like the action and intention of the individual. What was the point I was going to make? I can't. Yeah, but when you read these things, and it tells you, like you were saying, Jesus in the Bible, 23 times he cast them out, and people, and it's as wacky, but for as long as I've been alive, whenever you've seen something like that, or you've seen a heroin addict on the street, just no one ever questioned, is that them making, is it themselves doing that, or is it something else puppeting them? You know what I mean?
No, yeah, nobody ever thinks about that. They just go, oh, they're crazy, stay away from them. They're afraid of them. And the system, it pushes that idea too. I mean, when the nurses would come through the psych units, they would tell them, don't look them in the eye. If you look them in the eye, they might do something. That's just a bunch of crap. They foster the fear, like, oh no, this is a very dangerous place. You can't come in here and investigate anything because we can't take the risk of them hurting you. I mean, I've been at this for 45 years. I haven't been hurt by any of them. Now, some of my colleagues have, but I haven't. And I was the one poking through their heads the most. That it's not, they want to foster the fear. They don't want anybody coming in. In the 45 years I've been working with, in these different institutions, I never, ever saw a single researcher come in there ever. They never came to the front lines. All this was done through the institutions, through the schools, through the universities. They print these, they put out these papers that were 80% of what psychology publishes is crap. They did a study. I forgot which organization did it, but they did a study of followed up on these papers that the psychologists and psychiatrists put out. 80% of them were a bunch of garbage. They weren't replicable.
Yep.
So it's trash. It's just publish or perish. That's what the universities do.
Yep.
Publish or perish. They don't care what you publish. As long as you get your name on there with the university's name, you're good.
Yep. It's crazy. I mean, like that, and it's not even just psychiatry. Like I know for a fact, the guy that won the, like you were saying, publish or perish, the guy that won the Nobel Peace Prize for discovering HIV has absolutely no test or baseline, like you were saying with that, to prove the existence of HIV. There's not anything. There's nothing, and it's just like this whole. It's like they've replaced this demonology with a physical kind of replica of like virology. Like if you look, people talk about their gut bacteria and these things, they get in and they feed off all the bad stuff you put in your body. It's like, are they physical or are they spiritual? You know what I mean? It's like, I remember you brought up the point. How many times do we throw the phrase around? Like I remember my parents would do this to me. They'd be like, "Oh, I can't believe what's gotten into you," and just hundreds and hundreds of times people will say that, and they'll never ever go, well, that, like, hey, do you want to go to the bar, get a shot of spirits and some gin? And they've never went, so that sounds familiar. Gin sounds a lot like gin. You know?
And they'll even say the devil made me do it, kind of half jokingly. I mean, these things are real. They're very real. They hit all of us. And the thoughts they put into our thought stream sound just like all the thousands of other thoughts that go through your mind on a regular day. There's no difference. There's no like, oh, you better do this now. No, they sound just like all your other thoughts. They just inject them into your thought stream and say, well, why don't you do this? They sound just like all the other tens of thousands of other thoughts. Or, why don't you kick that dog? Or why don't you do this? Or why don't you insult this person? Or da-da-da-da. All bad stuff. But it's up to you to make the choice.
And you would say the differentiator is the intention from them is to turn your energy negative.
The intention.
So would you then say that, like, because I think it was how you said Howard Pittman said that every single sin committed by man was on behalf of these entities and you chose to do it. So would you then conclude that pretty much, and I'm swaying towards this thinking habit now, that every single negative thought you get is from them? Or every not negative, but what would I say? Not because there's negative as in like if you catch your wife cheating on you, then you're going to break up with her. I don't know if that's a gin or not, but like everything that's that aims to create negative emotion, like bad thoughts about yourself, or a low self-esteem, or a bad image of someone else. They're all from them.
Yep. Sherry says that every negative thought about yourself or anybody else comes from them.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense.
And not only do they hate kids, they hate relationships. They work overtime to break up marriages. They don't like people being happy. They don't like them being married. They destroy relationships at a record rate.
It's crazy.
And you look at the divorce rate in the U.S. The divorce rate's 50%.
Yep. I can give you a little anecdote. In Islam, I don't know if it's Quran or Hadith, forgive me, but in Islam, the idea is that Satan or the shaitan has a hierarchy again, and the foot soldiers will come back at the end of the day and report what they've done to man, and you committed a murder. There's a story that I think it's something along the lines of they'll have committed a murder, and he's like, oh, fine. And the one thing that he gets super excited about is turning a husband against wife, just constantly breaking the family, break the family. It's like, oof.
Yeah, exactly. Same thing with preachers.
Yep.
They get 10 points for taking down a preacher.
Yeah, 100%.
And one thing different with Christianity kind of blows off these demons. It's like, they talk about them. They don't take them serious. Islam takes them much more seriously. Yeah. They have specific prayers to fight back against demons.
Yep.
They take them much more seriously. They know much more about them and how they operate than the average Christian.
Yep.
That blows them off.
I mean, every time before me and my wife go to bed, the throne verse, we say the throne verse. And I've noticed that just a cultural thing. And it's interesting because Christianity has the same stuff. I don't quite know why they don't treat it as severely, but I've noticed hanging around more Muslims that they do treat it with sincerity. And it's funny because you'll go from a Western lifestyle where these things aren't acknowledged, and when I hang around Muslims, you'll be sitting there just eating tea, and one of them will just start speaking, but it'll be a verse in the Quran that's dedicated to getting these things away. And I kind of hope Christianity. I mean, it would be interesting to see a world where this was taught in schools, because I think, if you look at every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Besides the fact they're unknown, they don't have much defense. Like as soon as you identify them, they kind of lose their power. I think you mentioned that the only real fear they have is, and that's what they're punished on as well, is being identified. And it's like, imagine if everyone was taught this in school. Imagine how different the world would be. That when you get angry at your fellow man, if you realized that it wasn't you getting mad at him, it was you had an enemy that was trying to provoke a negative emotion, like the world would change so quick.
Right, but they got it set up so it's okay, secular on one side and religion on the other side, and unfortunately the secular side controls the education.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's interesting. I mean, I would just ask you, and please don't think I'm coming at, because I'm not one of these purity guys who's like, you must now accept the law. Like I hate that stuff. I don't like it. I'm more just intrigued. I take it like, how do you now see life? Like I can't imagine. I mean, I had a little ongoing joke with my wife that was like, because when we watch your videos, sometimes you have like have you ever seen the 1,000-mile stare of soldiers? You ever seen that? So it's like, I think in World War II, a soldier would have seen so much suffering that it's like a stare went in 1,000 miles because he'd just seen so much. And sometimes I can kind of see it in you. Like, it's just like, I've been fighting demons all my life. It's like, what's your sort of, like, I take it you can't come out the other end and not see the world completely different.
Well, I kind of feel like a combat veteran that goes into battle after battle after battle, and it's like, my whole life I've been fighting these things and trying to educate people about them. It's like combat fatigue.
Yeah, because
I see it. I see it around me all the time. I see it in the news. I see it in, schizophrenics. I can spot them a mile away. It's like you said. I know that they're out there. I mean, I have no doubt in my mind that they're out there. I have no doubt in my mind that they're going to get me in whatever way they can.
Did you ever get worried, like, the more this met? Because I think the first time I came across you was about 2 months ago, and I've started sharing your stuff with my audience, and I've seen some of your videos go from 500 views to 15,000 in a week. And I think for you personally, that's going to keep going and going. I know Owen, who you're going to speak to shortly, he has just a religious group of people with 70,000 who watch every single week. And do you ever get worried, like, the bigger or more you start to spread the message, the more these things might be like, right, Jerry, now you're in trouble.
I mean? What they've done now, I remember a time when I heard a psychologist was having a lot of trouble with his son, and I'm like, well, I couldn't comprehend that.
Yeah.
They got back at me. They took my son. He has mental problems. He will not listen to anything I say. He's rebellious. He's paranoid. He can't function. That's how they got back at me. And I could help him, but he doesn't listen to anything I say. He's out there by himself now, living in a hotel. They've taken him.
Crazy, eh? It's crazy. I mean, yeah, it's good. I take it. What are you thinking? Because how old are you now?
I'm 73.
73. I take it you probably now, after experiencing all this, isn't sort of just like infinite blackness forever once you pass. I take it you're more. Well, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. That's not what I mean. But are you now more inclined to think that this is like a temporary life and there's something that comes after it? After seeing like Swedenborg.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I think they did a thing where they weigh the human body just after it's died, like the second it's died, and it's lighter. So it's like your
No,
soul.
they haven't been able to find any difference in weight.
Oh, really? Oh, I must have heard that from
Yeah.
another book.
No, they
Yeah.
did. They couldn't find it. They did that, and there was no difference because the soul doesn't weigh anything.
That's what it is.
So I spend a lot of time reading Swedenborg's works. I think he explains things much better than anything else. So a kind of elementary version of his works are on a YouTube channel called Off the Left Eye with Curtis.
I think I know what you're talking about.
He's got a hundreds of videotapes all about Swedenborg. Swedenborg was a Christian mystic who was allowed to travel through heaven and hell. He would go into a trance for 3 days, and then he'd come back and he'd write about what he saw after interviewing entities in heaven and hell. And what he describes as demons match exactly what Wilson Van Dusen, the clinical psychologist, and myself both found with the voices. The voices schizophrenics here match exactly what Swedenborg was saying the evil spirits are in hell.
There you go, Ed. It's crazy. So I think well, I feel bad for anyone that was watching this at night for the first time. And you went through the same process I went through. So I think to conclude, so I would say I want to run this by you if I can get it. I kind of created a list of stuff that's helped me start to identify and get away from these things. I'll see if I can find it. If it takes too long, I'll just do it off the top of my head. I don't think I'm going to find it. Yeah. So it was something along the lines of just identify that's a lie, and
That's
then
a lie.
recite either the 23rd Psalm or the throne verse from the Quran.
No,
there was
Psalm 91. Psalm 91 too.
91 too. Okay, Psalm 91. I'm going to write that down. And then there was something else. There was something that helped me.
That's a lie.
There was one with a rubber wristband as well, which actually helped me. You know, you were talking about how they shortcut reasoning.
Yeah.
Rubber wristband, you snap it, snaps you back in for a couple of seconds.
Yep, that shuts them up. It gives you enough time to say the prayers.
Can you remember
They hate those prayers.
What was the second Psalm? Sorry, Psalm 91.
91.
Psalm 91. Perfect. And then the Mace Energy Method. I'm gonna leave links to Jerry's website and the Mace site as well, because I have no financial affiliation, and even if I did, this life's temporary. I'm not going to get to take any money with me. That has been arguably the best, most fast, efficient way of going back into traumas and getting rid of it.
I've been in this field for close to 50 years, and I've never seen anything work like Mace does.
It's
Nothing.
rapid. It's instant. It's instant.
Very rapid, and it not only it cures the problem. It doesn't just you don't just sit there and talk about it and mull it over and over again, and it makes it worse by bringing it up over and over and over again. It actually gets rid of the problem, and it does it quick, and it it only takes a few sessions to really clean you out.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to go on for years and months forever.
And you also don't have to disclose the certain issue that you're struggling with either.
That's another interesting facet. The therapist doesn't need to know what the trauma is that you're dealing with. It works anyway. It's the only therapy that I know where the therapist doesn't need to know what happened.
Because I can imagine that's probably a stumbling block. Especially, I mean, I remember. I think just really quickly, we'll wrap it up in the next couple of minutes. But I remember the guy you were. There was there was a kid that his mum, his mum and dad broke up. His dad was an alcoholic. They would beat him, and then his mum would bring strange men round to her house, and the mum wouldn't feed the kid. And then at about 6 years old, from all the trauma, the voices came into the kid's head. He's had them since. So I think a lot of times these traumas, these voices come in, and this is one thing you've identified, is the pattern schizophrenics have is insane, horrifying levels of trauma when they're growing up. They're just shocking levels. So if there's someone who's experienced like a molestation, that can be kind of hard to talk to about with someone. But the mace, they don't have to know. It's a very interesting system, but just don't like it. It ticks all the boxes and it works quick. So
well, I'm glad you experienced it. You know, because it's almost hard to believe how quickly it works and how well it works.
Yeah, but would you say, just this is more just me being selfish, and I want to kind of pick your brain. Would you say do you think it's kind of like going to the gym, or it's more like taking antibiotics? So like, say you how am I trying to word this? Is it something you should do on a regular basis? Would you say no?
No. It doesn't go on and on and on.
Yeah.
What it does is it goes in there and it removes this subconscious programming that you picked up via trauma, and it takes it and it drains it. And once it does that, that whole chain of events that are connected to that trauma all go down with it. It's like breaking the link of a chain.
Yeah.
You know, you're not just dealing with that one particular trauma. All similar traumas or all similar abusers all go down together. So if there's you got a rotten father who beat you all the time and did all these rotten things, what happens normally is that gets buried in the back of your mind, and every time you run into a person like that, there's a reaction. It's a negative reaction. There's a fight or flight response comes up. You either, you don't like that person, there's a negative reaction, you get ready to fight, you get ready to avoid, or you get ready to run, every single time. And the universe keeps bringing these people to you over and over and over again, saying, hey, you got a problem here, you got a problem here. Mace goes in there and breaks that chain. So now, once you dealt with that issue with Mace, all the other similar traumas from people like that go down with it. The whole chain goes down. So you're not just getting rid of one particular trauma, you're getting rid of all the traumas that are also associated with it, which is very interesting.
It's like I think I've been reading John Mace's, I can't remember what the book is called. It's not Causism, it's the first Energy Over Mind, I think it is. And it's talking about how there's mind, body, spirit, but the one that's forgotten is identity. And it's like these it's like, you talk about survival. Everything we do is survival based. But you have identities which you kind of you live by, and they also are trying to survive. So these, I'm completely paraphrasing and doing a bit of disservice, but it's like you were saying, if you have had an abusive father, every time you come across a guy like him or a situation that resembles what you went through, energy turns negative. These entities smell it like a shark smells water. They come, and so it's kind of like you go back in. That's what I was saying when I did it. I was digging up these memories, bang, vivid, popped into your head, and I was like, "Oh, dearie me!" I couldn't remember it happened. I'd never since it happened remembered it happened, and then gone, completely discharged. It's like you dissolve it, gone. So
I've never seen anything like it, and I've been through all that stuff. I mean, 8 years. 4 years of undergraduate, 2 years of master's, 2 years in a PhD program. I've seen it all. They don't have anything that works like Mace. Nothing. And the establishment doesn't want this out there. They want to maintain the status quo. They want you to use drugs. They want you to go to psychiatry. They want you to go to psychotherapists. None of that stuff works like Mace does. This is the most effective thing I've ever seen in my entire career.
Yeah, big time. Right, Jerry, I'll let you crack on now. I could go on all day, and I'm not just saying. I know. Probably everybody says that when they have somebody on a show. They're like, "Oh, but I would."
What's the name of your website?
What webs? I have a bunch of websites.
Oh, good. Okay. Which one will you be putting this on?
This will just be on YouTube.
Just YouTube?
Yeah. I'll send you the link to it once it's up. I'll get it up tomorrow.
Okay. No rush.
Yeah, perfect. And then and yeah, so like I said, I could have you on all day, but I'll let you crack on. It's 11 p.m. for me as well. So
Oh yeah. Well, I know some other interesting characters we can bring on eventually. One gal's she's an RN. She was able to see spirits from the time she was a young kid. She still does. She had to keep that quiet. She did an internship on a psych ward, and she was able to see these entities on these patients.
yeah, because
She,
I've had a whole. I just want to quickly say I think I keep interrupting you, and I don't mean to. I think it's the connection. I think one of us is a second in front of the other, so I do apologize for that because it looks like I'm coming across as rude
no problem.
but well, I can't remember what I was going to say now. Yeah, that sort of stuff's right. I mean, I have a whole list of stuff here, like the shadow people, and things like methamphetamines, DMT. I could go on for days. So I'm more than happy. I know you're booked out for a while, but I'm absolutely more than happy to have anyone on that you want to have on anytime you need. It'd be more than my pleasure.
Okay. Well, we'll be in touch then. And
Awesome.
if I get too busy, you just write me back and go, hey, like you get one of the, because I got a handful of very interesting people that are able to also come on and kind of verify what I've seen and experienced from their own perspective, including people who have been in psych hospitals and got out.
Yeah, big time. Well, just in that time we're waiting, just I'll make sure my wife keeps me in check and I don't go near a Ouija board or anything.
No, don't touch it. They're bad. Don't touch. Stay away from them.
So yeah, right. We'll wrap up there for people who see this. That's Jerry Marzinsky. I'll leave the links in the description to the MACE method, Jerry's website. Jerry's not slipping brown envelopes under the table here. It's high quality, and it serves a purpose. If you spend 45 minutes one day going through his website, that's a live program, recommended readings, testimonials. There's different articles about demonology, etc., etc. You'll learn more in about 45 minutes that's relevant to you than you did during your minor jail campaign called the schooling system. So just flick through that, and I'll hopefully, unless I become encompassed by Jinn, have Jerry back on shortly. And if I hear any electrical crackling tonight, I'll be sure to let you know, because I wouldn't be surprised. I'll have a quick look if there's a full moon out.
Okay.
Right, awesome, Jerry. Right, I'll let you crack on, and I'll speak to you soon, right?
Okay, thanks for having me on.
No worries, man. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye.